In the oldest stories of Polynesia, humanity traces its beginnings not to a distant ancestor, but to the embrace of two vast cosmic beings, the sky above and the earth below. Rangi, the Sky Father, and Papa, the Earth Mother, once clung tightly together, locked in an endless union. Between their bodies, pressed in darkness, their many children came into existence. There was no light, no space to stand upright, no horizon to gaze upon. Time itself was remembered as a succession of deep nights, long ages of shadow stretching across countless divisions. Existence was crowded and confined, and though life had multiplied, it had never seen the dawn. In that suffocating darkness, the children began to wonder what lay beyond their prison. They sensed that light must exist, that something different from endless night was possible. So they gathered and debated their fate. Should they destroy their parents and end the confinement forever, or should they attempt to force them apart and create space for the world to breathe? Tumatawenga, fierce and unyielding, urged violence. Tāne Mahuta, guardian of forests and growing things, proposed another path. Let the sky be lifted high, and the earth remain beneath as a nurturing mother. Let there be distance instead of death. Most agreed. Only Tauhiri Mati, lord of winds and storms, refused. He loved the closeness of his parents and feared the loss of his domain. Still, the others prepared to act. One by one they rose to push sky and earth apart. Rongo Matane, patron of cultivated food, struggled and failed. Tangaroa, ruler of oceans and sea creatures, tried and could not move them. Haumia Tikitiki, guardian of wild-growing food, exerted his strength without success. Even Tumatawenga could not separate them. At last, Tāne Mahuta stepped forward. He pressed his head against the earth, planted his feet against the sky, and with immense effort forced them apart. The sky was thrust upward, the earth pressed downward, and for the first time light flooded the world. The cries of Rangi and Papa echoed in grief, but the separation could not be undone. Space, air, and daylight entered existence. Life emerged into this new world. Yet Tauhiri Mati, enraged by the tearing apart of his parents, withdrew to the upper realms with his father. There he gathered strength and brought forth his offspring. The winds from every direction, the squalls, the towering clouds, the thunderheads, the roaring gales. He unleashed them upon his brothers. Forests were shattered as mighty trees snapped and fell. Seas rose into mountainous waves. Tangaroa fled as the waters churned violently. His descendants divided in panic. Fish retreated to the ocean depths, while reptiles sought refuge on land. From that moment, rivalry and tension marked their existence. The storm, God's fury, struck the cultivated fields and the wild plants, but Earth hid those children safely within her soil. Finally, Tauhiri Mati turned on Tumatawenga. Yet the fierce one stood firm. Unlike the others, he did not bend or flee. He endured the storm and remained upright. In time, the rage subsided, and a fragile balance returned. Tumatawenga then reflected on his brother's weakness. They had abandoned him during the storm, leaving him to stand alone. In response, he resolved to assert dominance over them. From forest leaves he fashioned snares and trapped the birds of Tāne Mahuta. From flax he wove nets to capture the fish of Tangaroa. With digging tools he unearthed the roots protected by Rongo Matan and Haumia Tikitiki. In this way, humankind claimed authority over forest, sea, and soil, transforming former rivals into sources of sustenance. Only Tauhiri Mati remained unconquered, continuing to wage war through tempests and hurricanes. From then on, prayers and ritual chants were shaped to ensure balance with these forces. Words were spoken to calm the winds, to call fish into nets, to bless crops, and to ensure abundance. The natural world was not separate from humanity. but bound in ongoing struggle and cooperation. The violence of those early conflicts reshaped the land itself. Vast rains and relentless storms submerged great stretches of earth, leaving only fragments of dry land rising above the sea. Over time, light strengthened and life flourished across the open world. Generations followed, and among them appeared the culture hero Māui, whose daring deeds would one day bring mortality into human experience. Until that moment, death had not ruled mankind. But through deception and challenge to the powers beyond, mortality entered the human story. Maui's curiosity did not start with heroics or battles. It began with a simple question that none of his brothers could answer. He wanted to know where their parents truly lived, where the two elders went when the night ended and the morning arrived. He asked again and again, not as a passing thought, but as a need that would not loosen its grip. The brothers could only shrug. They spoke in guesses and uncertainty, saying the parents might be somewhere above the world, or beneath it, or far away in a place no one could reach. To them, the question felt pointless. To Maui, it felt unfinished, like a door in the mind that had to be opened. They laughed at him at first. He was the youngest, the last to arrive, the one they believed knew the least. How could he find what the older brothers had never seen? Yet Maui did not argue in circles. He simply said he would discover the truth, and that they should stay where they were and listen for news. That confidence came from something he had already learned, something the others had not noticed, even though it had been happening in their home for years. Long before this, there had been a night that changed everything. The family had gathered in the great meeting house where people sang, danced, and celebrated together. In the middle of that lively crowd, a small child slipped inside and hid himself behind one of the older brothers. When the dancing was about to begin, their mother counted her children as she always did, calling each by name. She named 4, as if that was all there could ever be. Then her eyes caught a 5th presence where none should be. Confused and startled, she demanded to know where this extra child had come from. The hidden child spoke up, calm and bold, claiming he was hers too. The mother denied it at once. She insisted she had only 4 sons, that this stranger must belong to someone else. The argument unfolded in full view of the dancers, a tense dispute cutting through the rhythm of the celebration. Maui did not retreat. He answered with a story that only someone connected to her could know, and he told it without pleading. He said he had been born near the sea and cast away. Wrapped in a piece of her own hair, he had been surrendered to the surf and left among the foam. He described being carried by rolling waves, tangled in sea plants, pushed and pulled until the wind drove him back toward shore. He spoke of soft creatures on the beach curling around him like a living shelter, and of insects gathering and birds circling, ready to tear a helpless infant apart. Then, he said, an old ancestor came upon the strange sight, saw what was happening, and hurried forward. The old man stripped away the covering and found a child still alive. He carried the baby home, warmed him in the roof space above the fire, and kept him safe until he grew strong. Maui ended by proving he knew the names the mother had always spoken, the names of the 4 brothers she counted every night, and he recited them one by one without hesitation. Then he gave his own, placing himself before them as the missing 5th. The mother's certainty broke. She accepted him openly, not with cold apology, but with sudden emotion, calling him her youngest, the child of her later years, and giving him a name that bound him to her identity and her hair knot. That night, she asked him to sleep beside her, inviting closeness that the older brothers had not received in a long time. The others watched it happen, and jealousy rose like heat in a closed room. They whispered that it was unfair. that they were the sons everyone had seen born and raised. Yet the mother now showed special tenderness to the one who had returned from the sea as if he had been shaped by the ocean itself. Some of the brothers complained bitterly, wondering who had truly raised him, whether he belonged to them at all. Others tried to calm the anger, warning that family quarrels could grow into something worse, reminding them how old divisions among greater beings had once led to endless conflict. Better to stay united, they said. Better to settle disputes with peace before they turned into wounds that could only be answered by violence. Eventually the murmuring faded and the household returned to its routines. But one habit never changed. Each night their mother came home and slept among them, and each morning, before anyone could properly wake, she vanished. The older brothers had grown used to it and no longer questioned it. Maui did. At first he tried to excuse it, thinking she had simply gone out early to prepare food or check something outside. Yet the pattern was too exact, too secretive. Night after night she was present. Day after day she was gone, leaving no explanation behind. So Maui decided to watch the moment of departure, and to do that he needed to stop the morning itself from pushing her into motion. One night, while the others slept, he quietly gathered her clothing and hid it. Then he sealed the cracks in the doorway and blocked every gap where dawn light could slip in. He did it carefully, not for mischief but for truth, and even then he worried she might rise in the darkness and escape his plan. The night dragged on. The first faint sign of morning arrived, and still she did not stir. Outside the sun climbed higher, yet inside the house it remained dim, as if time had slowed. When she finally woke, she sensed something was wrong. The night had lasted too long. She drifted back to sleep, woke again, and still could not understand why daylight had not reached her. At last, she sprang up and discovered she was uncovered and exposed, her garments missing. She searched in panic, found nothing, and tore away the plugs in the walls and doorway. Light poured in. The sun was already high in the sky. Shock turned to fury and shame. With nothing else to cover herself, she grabbed an old rough cloak-like scrap that had been used to block the door and ran outside, crying out in distress as she fled. Maui did not rush after her immediately. He watched from the threshold, low to the ground, careful not to lose sight of her. She ran across the land until she reached a small patch of rushes. She seized the tuft, lifted it as if it were a simple bundle of plants, and revealed a hidden opening beneath. Then she dropped into the hole, pulled the rushes back into place, and disappeared as if the earth had swallowed her. Maui surged forward the moment she was gone. He tore the rushes aside and peered down. There was no shallow pit, but a real passage, a deep opening leading into the ground. He covered it again, returned to the house, and woke his brothers with sharp words. The sun was high, proof that something unusual had happened. Once they were up, Maui asked the old question again, pressing harder now, because he had seen the doorway to the answer. The brothers still tried to dismiss it. They spoke instead about the world itself, about how the sky sends breezes, mists, clear weather, rain, and dew, and how the earth answers by growing food. To them, these were the only parents that mattered, the great forces that actually sustained life. Maui agreed that such ideas made sense, but he challenged their indifference. They had once known their mother's closeness, he said. They had been fed and nurtured. He had not. He had never tasted her milk or lived under her care. Yet he still felt love for her, simply because he had begun within her body. That was enough to make him want the truth. He wanted to see where she went and to find the father whose presence seemed hidden behind all those early mornings. His words changed the brothers' mood. They were surprised by the depth of his attachment, and instead of mocking him again, they told him to try. If anyone could do it, perhaps it was the one who had returned from the sea and refused to accept the easy answer. Maui prepared in his own way. He was known for taking new shapes when it suited his purpose, and in the past he had tried many forms, none of which impressed his brothers. This time he chose a form they admired. A pigeon, calm and beautiful, its markings striking. Part of the elegance came from a secret detail. The bright band across the bird's chest and the dark curve at its throat were not natural colours at all, but the look of stolen things. The belt and apron Maui had taken from his mother during the night of his trap. In that form he seemed unusually convincing, not hopping wildly from branch to branch, but sitting still and watchful, cooing softly as though he belonged to the forest. At dawn he spoke to his brothers one last time, reminding them that his journey was driven by love rather than pride. He warned that long travel might weaken him, that even unusual skills can fade with time, but he would go anyway. The brothers encouraged him, imagining that if he found the hidden dwelling place, they could all visit it, ending the strange distance that had always surrounded their family. Then he flew. He reached the spot where the rushes concealed the opening, lifted the cover, and dropped into the narrow passage. The tunnel was tight at first. He had to angle his wings, dipping one side and then the other as he moved deeper. The passage widened gradually, and he rushed forward faster, the air changing as the world above grew distant. Eventually he came into a place that did not feel like a cramped tunnel anymore. Trees grew there, and a group of people sat beneath them as if in a quiet gathering. Maui perched above them in the branches and watched. Among those seated were two elders, a man and a woman lying close on the grass, familiar in a way that required no explanation. He listened as names were spoken, as voices addressed them, and recognition settled in his mind like certainty. He had found the place. He had found them. He did not reveal himself immediately. Instead, he tested the moment. He plucked a small berry and dropped it gently, letting it strike the older man's forehead. Someone glanced upward, wondering if a bird had done it, but the man brushed it off as chance. Maui dropped more berries, harder this time, striking both the man and the woman sharply enough that it hurt. Now the group reacted. People stood, craned their necks, searched the canopy, and heard the cooing that gave away the bird's position. Stones were picked up. Hands hurled them upward for a long time, again and again, missing as the pigeon stayed just out of reach. The crowd that rushed in around the fallen bird did not know what to do with what they were seeing. A moment earlier it had been a pigeon, injured and fluttering on the ground. Now it was a young man, staring up with a hard, unblinking intensity. His eyes were so bright and fierce that people recoiled as if they had stepped too close to fire. Some whispered that the red in his gaze looked like pigment, like the deep colour used to mark sacred things. Others, shaken by the sudden change, said it finally made sense why the creature had sat so still in the branches. A real bird would have fled at the first stone, but this had waited, almost daring them to notice it. Fear quickly turned into speculation. A few insisted he was not merely human. They said his shape and presence felt older than ordinary life, as if something from the first age had returned, something not seen since the world was first opened and the great parents of sky and earth were forced apart. In the middle of the confusion, Taranga stepped forward, staring at him as though a memory had walked into daylight. She told the people around her that this face was not entirely new. Night after night, she said, while travelling to visit her children, she had sensed someone like him, a presence that had haunted the edge of her life. Now, seeing the young man clearly, she began to speak of a hidden birth near the sea and of a desperate act that could never be fully forgotten. She described how long ago on the shoreline she had brought a child into the world too soon, in a moment that felt like loss before life had even begun. She cut a lock of her hair and wrapped the infant tightly, then cast the bundle into the foaming surf. The sea took it. Winds and waves carried it. Yet the child did not vanish. An elder of the line, a revered ancestor, came upon the strange sight of beach creatures and circling birds gathering around something on the sand. The old man tore away the living cover, discovered the infant still breathing, and carried him home. There, close to warmth and smoke, the child was kept alive until he grew strong enough to walk among people. Taranga repeated the story with a certainty that silenced the murmuring, and when she finished, the shock in the listeners changed into a tense attention. Then, Taranga questioned the young man directly, as if testing whether the truth would hold. She asked if he had come from the west. He denied it. She asked about other directions, one after another, and each time the answer was no. At last she asked if he had been brought by the moving air itself, by the very breath that travels over sea and land. This time he answered yes. That single reply broke the last of her doubt. She named him again, first by rejecting the names of the older brothers and then by speaking the one that fit him alone. When he confirmed it, her voice rose with triumph and relief. She welcomed him openly and spoke as though his arrival carried a promise for the whole human future. In that welcome there was hope as well as pride. The idea that this child, shaped by ocean force and storm-driven winds, might one day confront the shadow that ends all living things. The household did not treat the moment as ordinary recognition. The father, Makea Tutara, led the boy to water for rites, meant to set him apart, to cleanse him and place him under protection. Words were spoken, formal and careful, meant to secure blessing and strength. But the ceremony left the father unsettled. He realized too late that a portion of the sacred words had been rushed, a line skipped in error. In stories like these, mistakes in such moments do not remain small. The father's fear grew sharp and immediate because he believed the unseen powers would answer the flaw by turning fate against the child. That night, even as the family gathered under a roof again, anxiety sat close to the warmth of the fire. Not long after, Maui returned to the place where his brothers lived and told them he had reached their parents' dwelling and proved it with his own eyes. Yet the discovery did not soften him into quiet domestic life. Soon an edge returned, and trouble followed. The young figure took his first victim, then struck again in another way, using hidden force to ruin crops and leave fields, withering where they should have been green. The pattern was becoming clear. This was not a hero who only searched and reunited families. This was also a figure who tested boundaries, punished enemies, and pushed at the limits of what the world would allow. When Maui visited his parents again and stayed among their people for a time, he began noticing an odd routine. Each day, someone carried a gift of food away from the settlement, walking the same path with the same careful purpose. Maui asked who it was meant for. The answer was simple. An ancestress, Muri Ranga Wenua. When he asked where she lived, they pointed out the direction, as if it were obvious. Maui said that was enough. He would carry the gift himself. From that day forward he took the daily offering, but he did not deliver it as it was intended. He set it aside, quietly, repeatedly, letting days pass without the old woman receiving what was owed. It was not clumsy forgetfulness. It was deliberate pressure. Eventually the ancestress sensed deception. In her dwelling she stirred like something dangerous waking, sniffing the air, searching for the trace of a human being. She turned her head toward one direction, then another, testing the wind in slow arcs, tasting the air with suspicion. For a time she found nothing and nearly believed her instinct had been wrong. Then she tested the breeze coming from the west, and the scent reached her clearly. Her voice carried out with sudden certainty. Someone was close. Maui answered softly, not hiding anymore. The ancestress understood then that this presence belonged to her bloodline. The hunger that had been rising in her, the swelling urge to devour the intruder, fell back and tightened down. The story insists on the nearness of danger. If the wind had not carried his scent in time, the encounter would have ended violently. Now, with the threat calmed, she demanded to know why he had treated her with deceit. Maui did not pretend innocence. He said he wanted the jawbone that held power, the tool through which great acts could be forced into reality. The ancestress did not fight him for it. She told him to take it, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Maui carried the jawbone back to his brothers, and from that point, the tale shifts from family discovery into acts that reshape the world itself. Maui soon began complaining that the days were too short. The sun climbed, crossed the sky, and vanished too quickly, leaving barely enough time for work, travel, and survival. He argued that human life was being squeezed by the speed of daylight. One day he proposed an impossible solution: trap the sun and force it to slow down. His brothers reacted as expected. They said the heat was too fierce, that no one could approach it, that the very idea was madness. Maui answered by reminding them what they had already witnessed: his ability to alter his form, to become creature after creature and return again to himself. If such transformations were possible, then the sun could also be confronted. His confidence dragged the others along with him, not because they believed fully, but because they feared what he could do alone. They began making ropes and nooses, experimenting until they could braid flax into strong, square cords and flatter, tougher bands suited for binding. They worked until the set of ropes was complete. Maui took the jawbone weapon and gathered provisions. Then the brothers travelled by night, hiding at dawn so the sun would not see them moving across open land. Night after night they advanced eastward, toward the place where the sun seems to emerge. He promised to return quickly. He would go to the sacred place, find a ritual specialist, and make sure everything was done in the right order. Then the feast could begin without consequences, and what remained behind would stay fresh, while what was carried home would remain good. He had barely left the shore before the discipline he demanded collapsed. The brothers ignored his instructions as if they were only stubborn superstition. Food came out immediately. Knives and hands went to work. The catch was cut before any offering was made. It was not a quiet mistake, but a loud act of impatience. And in the logic of the story, impatience has weight. Maui was still on the road when the wrongness of it began to show itself. The great fish did not lie still. It thrashed as if alive again, twisting, jolting, lashing as though the land itself were a wounded body refusing to be carved. The shoreline trembled with motion. In the mythic explanation that follows, the island's uneven face is blamed on that moment. Mountains rising here, valleys dropping there, cliffs breaking the coast, plains stretching unevenly between rough folds. The land was hauled up, but it did not remain smooth. It became jagged because it was treated carelessly, before the proper respect was shown. The tale presents this as another major wound in the world's history, an imbalance following earlier cosmic ruptures. Even so, the new land remained. It was proof that what had been hidden under the ocean could be drawn into daylight. The hook and the power behind it became part of memory. People in later generations pointed to places on the coast and said the tool itself had changed into features of the shoreline, stone and cape and long curves of land reaching into the sea. Marks left behind by an act that reshaped the map. Maui, meanwhile, did not settle into calm. His mind turned from sea to fire, from from islands to the flames that warmed homes and cooked food. He began to wonder whether fire was truly secure in human hands, or whether it depended on a deeper source that could be challenged. One night he moved through the village silently and extinguished every ember in every cooking shelter. When morning came, he called out loudly that he was hungry and demanded food. Servants rushed to light fires and found only cold ash. They ran from house to house searching for a spark. But the entire village was dark. No smoke rose. No warmth answered. Taranga heard the confusion and told the household to go to the ancient firekeeper, Mahuika, and ask for flame again. But the servants hesitated. The old woman's name carried fear. They refused, even when ordered repeatedly. They did not want to walk into the presence of the one who held fire in her body. Maui stepped in, as if the refusal only confirmed his own plan. He said he would go himself, but asked which path led to her dwelling. His parents pointed out a broad track and warned him directly. If the firekeeper questioned him, he should speak his name so she would recognize his lineage. And then came the sharper warning: no tricks. They had heard what kind of figure he was becoming, someone whose deeds looked greater than human limits, someone who liked to test and deceive. They urged him not to provoke this ancestress. Maui answered casually, saying the goal was simple: bring fire back for people. He would be quick. He would not cause trouble. He travelled to the place where the firekeeper lived and paused, struck silent by what he saw. It was not like arriving at an ordinary house. The atmosphere itself felt dangerous, as if heat had become a living presence. When he finally spoke, he asked for fire directly, requesting a light to carry back to the village. The old woman rose and studied him with suspicion. She questioned where he came from, trying different directions as if the truth could be smelled on the air. Maui denied each one until she asked whether he came with the wind that blew straight toward her. He agreed, and that answer shifted her stance. If he came by that wind, he belonged to her line. She welcomed him as kin and offered him what he asked for. Then she revealed the secret of her power. She did not reach for wood or stone. She pulled one of her fingernails free, and fire flowed from it, as if flame was stored inside her body. She handed it to him as easily as someone might pass a torch. Maui stepped away and extinguished it. He returned and said the light had died, and asked for another. Again she pulled a nail. Again he walked off and put it out. He repeated this over and over, turning a gift into a test, draining her one nail at a time. She gave, and he wasted. She gave again, and he wasted again. One hand lost its nails, then the other, then her toes. Each time Maui returned with the same calm request, as if the fault lay in the fire, not in his actions. At last, the old woman understood. Her remaining nail, the last one, became her final answer. She tore it free and hurled it down in fury, releasing fire so violently that the ground itself ignited. The blaze spread with a speed that turned the landscape into a trap. Maui fled, and the flames chased him as if they had intelligence. He shifted shape to escape, becoming a swift bird and trying to outrun the heat in the air. The fire still climbed after him. He plunged into water, but even the pools felt dangerously hot. Trees ignited, the forest began to burn. Land and sea seemed caught in the same rising fury. For a moment, the story places him on the edge of death, trapped between flame and boiling shelter. Desperate, he called on the storm powers, ancestral forces tied to wind, thunder, and rain. The request was simple: water, enough to drown the pursuit. Then the weather answered. Gales arrived. Heavy rain fell in sheets. The flames hissed and collapsed under the downpour, and the firekeeper herself was forced to retreat, nearly overwhelmed by the sudden deluge. Her cries echoed the same panic Maui had felt under the fire's pressure. The confrontation ended not with quiet reconciliation, but with exhaustion and ruin. Yet fire did not vanish completely. Before the last of it was lost, sparks were saved, hidden within certain trees, sheltered in living wood. From that point onward, people could draw fire from those trees when they needed light. As if the old woman's power had been forced to retreat into nature itself. Maui returned to the village. His parents did not praise him. They reminded him that he had been warned and had ignored the warning. The trouble he faced was the natural consequence of provoking a dangerous ancestor. Maui brushed it off with the same defiance that marked his earlier acts. He spoke as if nothing could correct him, as if mischief and risk were permanent parts of his design. His father answered with a colder tone, saying survival depended on listening. If Maui refused advice, then life and death would become his own responsibility. Not long after, Maui looked for fresh conflict and found it within his own family circle. His sister, Hinari, was known for her beauty and she married Irawaru. One day, Maui and his brother-in-law went fishing together. Maui's line produced nothing. Irawaru's line kept rising heavy with fish. Maui watched the difference grow and felt irritation sharpen into anger. It was not only bad luck. It looked like someone else had an advantage. Then the lines tangled. Irawaru pulled quickly at a bite, and Maui, feeling tension on his own cord, imagined a fish was finally on his hook. Each man began hauling in a different direction, pulling the lines against each other. Maui shouted that the catch belonged to him. Irawaru insisted it was on his hook. The argument escalated, driven by Maui's frustration more than by the situation itself. Irawaru, trying to avoid a fight, loosened his line and let Maui haul the fish in. The result proved Irawaru had been right. The fish had been taken by his barbed hook. He asked for his hook and line back. Maui told him to wait while the hook was freed. When it came loose, Maui saw the barb clearly. The detail mattered. Maui's own hook had no barb, and in that instant his failure felt personal, as if it had been built into his gear while someone else had come prepared to win. The canoe slid back toward shore, heavy with fish and tension. When the brothers reached the beach and prepared to drag the vessel onto the sand, Maui turned to Irawaru with calculated calm. He told his brother-in-law to crouch beneath the outrigger and lift with his back. Irawaru obeyed without suspicion. The moment he was in position, Maui leapt upward and forced his weight down upon the canoe, crushing it against Irawaru's spine. The blow nearly ended his life. What followed was not an accident of anger, but a deliberate act of transformation. Maui pressed and twisted the body beneath him, stretching the backbone unnaturally, reshaping flesh and bone through force and spell alike. The man's form elongated, warped, and bent into something no longer human. Irawaru became a dog, altered beyond recognition, reduced to an animal's shape and dignity. The story says he was fed refuse, a final humiliation sealing the transformation. Maui returned to the settlement as though nothing remarkable had occurred. His sister, Hinari, waited for her husband's return and rushed forward when she saw Maui alone. She asked where Irawaru was. Maui answered casually that he had left him by the canoe. When she questioned why he had not come home as well, Maui told her that her husband had asked for her help in carrying up the fish. If she did not see him at once, he said, she should call out in a particular way. Hinari hurried to the shore and searched the beach. There was no sign of her husband. She called his name, and silence answered. Remembering Maui's instructions, she called out the strange sound he had taught her. From the nearby brush came a howl, unfamiliar yet desperate, and a dog emerged, running toward her, tail moving with recognition and longing. The creature's eyes held a trace of the man she knew. In that moment, the truth struck her. Her husband had been remade. The dog followed her back, responding to her voice as though bound to it. From that being, the tale claims, all dogs descend, and even later generations would use the same call to summon them. Grief overwhelmed Hinari. She returned to the village in anguish, weeping openly. Inside her house, she seized an enchanted girdle and ran toward the sea, driven by despair. At the edge of the water, she sat upon the rocks and lamented her fate. Then, after uttering words meant to seal her resolve, she cast herself into the ocean, surrendering to the depths and to whatever creatures waited below. The tide carried her away from land. Maui could not remain where this had happened. He left the village behind and went again to his parents. After some time, his father spoke with a mixture of pride and warning. He had heard of Maui's feats, of the sun slowed and the land raised, of victories both bold and reckless. Yet he cautioned that the challenges ahead in his father's homeland would not yield so easily. There was a power greater still, an ancestress, whose presence could be glimpsed at the horizon where earth and sky seemed to meet. Maui asked what force could possibly overcome him. His father named Hine Nui Tepo, the Great Woman of Night. Her eyes were described as glowing red in the distance, her teeth sharp as volcanic glass, her hair tangled like seaweed, her mouth terrible and vast. She embodied the boundary that no living being could cross without consequence. Maui dismissed the fear. He reminded his father of the sun itself, once unstoppable, now slowed by his blows. He spoke of the earth drawn up from beneath the sea. If such powers had yielded, why not death itself? The father did not retreat from his warning. He confessed something heavier. During Maui's baptism, part of the sacred words had been omitted. That error, he believed, left a weakness that fate would one day claim. Maui did not hesitate. He declared that he would confront this ancestress of night and test whether humanity must die or could live forever. He set out to gather companions. Not warriors, but small birds answered him, robins, thrushes, fantails, tiny creatures of forest and air. Together, they travelled at dusk and reached the dwelling of Hine Nui Tepo while she slept. Maui turned to the birds and gave them careful instructions. He intended to enter the body of the sleeping goddess and pass through her. If he succeeded, death itself would be undone. But they must not laugh at what they saw. If they laughed too soon and woke her, she would destroy him at once. Only when he had nearly emerged again could they release their laughter. The birds trembled at the sight before them, but agreed. Maui tightened the cords of his weapon around his wrist, stripped away his garments, and revealed skin marked with intricate patterns. Then he approached the immense form of the goddess and began the attempt. The small birds pressed their beaks shut, holding back their fear and astonishment, but one of them, unable to contain itself, burst into bright laughter. The sound rang sharply in the stillness. Hine Nui Tepo awakened instantly. Her eyes opened. She moved with terrible force. In that instant, the attempt failed. Maui was crushed and killed. With his death, the hope of ending mortality vanished. The story holds that if he had passed safely through the goddess, death would have been destroyed and humanity would have lived forever. Instead, death remained sovereign. A proverb emerged from this outcome, reminding later generations that life may produce heirs, yet death claims them all. With Maui's story set aside, the tradition shifts to another figure whose name is tied to storms, vengeance, and the road between earth and sky. Tauhaki was born to Hima and Rutonga, and he grew up alongside a younger brother, Karihi. As an adult, he married Hinepiripiri, linking himself to her family. and it was that connection that first brought him into danger. One day, he went fishing with her brothers along a reef that reached out like a stone arm into the sea. 4 brothers-in-law were with him. As the hours dragged on, 2 of them tired of fishing and turned back toward the settlement. Tauhaki followed, trusting them because they were family. Near the village, the mood changed. The 2 men attacked him, intent on killing him where no one would hear. They believed they had finished the job, buried him as if disposing of an inconvenience, and then walked home with empty faces. When they arrived, their sister asked where her husband was. They answered casually that everyone was still fishing. She waited, uneasy, until the remaining 2 brothers came back. When she asked them the same question, their reply contradicted the first story. They said the others had gone home long before. The mismatch was enough. Suspicion became certainty. She ran out immediately, searching the ground rather than the shoreline until she found disturbed earth. She uncovered Tauhaki and discovered he was not fully dead, only unconscious, battered, bleeding, abandoned. With effort that the tale treats as almost heroic in itself, she hauled him onto her back and carried him home. She washed the wounds, pressed them closed, and kept him alive through careful tending. When he could speak again, his first request was practical. A fire. He asked her to gather wood and light it. Then he gave a strange instruction. If she saw a tall tree nearby, she should cut it down and bring it whole. She did exactly that. She arrived dragging a full trunk, placed it on the fire without chopping it, and the house filled with heat and smoke as the great log burned. Later, when their first child was born, the boy was named for that uncut length of wood, a living reminder meant to keep a single duty sharp in the mind. The wrong done to Tauhaki would not be forgotten. Once Tauhaki recovered, he abandoned the district of the treacherous brothers-in-law. He moved with his own warriors and their families to a high mountain and built a fortified settlement, where ambush and betrayal would be harder to carry out. From that height he called upon ancestral powers for punishment. The story frames what followed as a catastrophe unleashed from above. Flood waters poured down, the land vanished under rushing torrents, and people perished on a massive scale. In the tradition, this was remembered as a great overwhelming of the world, a revenge so large it did not remain personal. After that, the brothers turned to a deeper grievance, the death of their father, Hamer. The ones responsible were not ordinary enemies, but a strange people known as the Ponaturi. They were said to live beneath the waters, yet they kept a large house on dry land where they returned at night to sleep. That house had a name, and it mattered because it was the single place where they could be reached. The Ponaturi had killed Hema and taken his body. Tonga, however, had been kept alive as a captive. Tauhaki and Karihi travelled until they reached a point where they could see the Ponaturi house. At that moment, it stood nearly empty. Only their mother sat near the doorway. Inside, hanging up beneath the high roof line, were the bones of their father displayed like a trophy or a warning. As the 2 brothers approached, Tauhaki began to chant. The tale describes a response from the dead. The bones rattled where they hung, as if recognizing the voice and the purpose that was coming. Tonga heard them too, and her tears began before her sons even reached her. When they finally arrived, grief took over. Mother and sons wept together, not only for what was lost, but for the fact that this reunion took place in enemy territory. Tonga urged them to flee. The Ponaturi, she said, were fierce and would kill them if discovered. Karihi asked when the Ponaturi returned. She answered that they rose from the sea when the sun sank beyond the horizon. She explained her role as well. She was kept alive to watch for dawn, stationed at the doorway, like a living alarm. Throughout the night, the Ponaturi called out to her, asking if morning had come, and she always answered that it was still deep night, telling them to sleep on. Karihi asked where they could hide. Urutonga warned that even if they concealed themselves, their scent would betray them. Karihi insisted they could use protective words to make themselves unseen. In the end, she agreed, not because she thought it safe, but because revenge had to be attempted. The brothers climbed onto the roof, burrowed into the thick thatch, and covered themselves. Before they hid completely, Urutonga gave a crucial instruction. Near dawn, every crack and opening in the house must be blocked, so not even a thread of light could enter. Evening came, and the sea gave up its inhabitants. The Ponaturi rose together, a mass returning from the water. As was their custom, one scout went first to check the path and the house. When he reached the threshold, he sensed something wrong and began sniffing and searching the interior. He nearly found the intruders. But the rest of the Ponaturi poured in behind him, crowding the house until the air itself was overwhelmed by bodies. In that density, the scent was lost. One by one they settled and fell asleep, trusting their routine and their numbers. At midnight, Tauhaki and Karihi slipped down and met their mother near the doorway. Karihi asked how to destroy the sleeping enemy. Urutonga answered with a method that did not require blades. Let the sun do it. In this tradition, sunlight was lethal to the Ponaturi. All that was needed was to trap them inside until dawn, then open the house to the morning. Urutonga returned inside. As the night continued, the Ponaturi called to her again and again, asking whether dawn had arrived. Each time she answered with the same lie, still night, still deep night, urging them back into sleep. Near the edge of morning, she whispered to her sons outside, "Seal every chink, block the doorway and window, keep the darkness complete until the moment of choice." When dawn finally arrived and the sun climbed into full brightness, the questioning began again. This time, Urutonga answered yes. Immediately, she called to her sons to pull the blocks away. The openings were cleared and sunlight flooded in like a weapon. The Ponaturi woke into the light and withered. They did not fall by human hands. They were destroyed by the morning itself. When the house fell silent, Tauhaki and Karihi took down their father's bones and burned them, joining that act to the ruin of the enemy. Then they left the place, carrying Urutonga and the remains of Hema, returning to their own country with vengeance complete. The story then shifts again, from war to reputation. News of Tauhaki's courage and his striking appearance travelled upward, reaching a young woman of the Sky People. Curious, she descended at night to see him for herself. She found him asleep, watched him for a long time, then lay beside him. He stirred but drifted back into sleep, thinking it was only a woman of the earth. Before dawn, she rose and returned to the sky. In the morning, Tauhaki woke and reached out, feeling for the warmth he had sensed, but found only emptiness. Night after night she returned, and dawn after dawn she vanished, until she conceived a child. Then she revealed herself fully and stayed with him in the world below, choosing Tauhaki over her kin above. A child was born, this time a girl. Before the baptismal rite, Tauhaki took the baby to a spring to wash her. Then, in a careless moment that became decisive, he held the child away and spoke as if disgusted by her smell. For the Sky Woman, that single insult broke something. She began to weep, then rose with the child and moved toward the air as if drawn back to her homeland. She paused at the ridgepole above the doorway, one foot resting there, and Tauhaki lunged forward to seize her. He missed. He begged her to return. She refused. He asked for something to remember her by. From above, she called down a warning instead. If he ever tried to follow, he must not grab the vine that swung loose in the air. He had to hold the one that was anchored, the vine that reached down and rooted into earth. Then she rose into the sky and disappeared. Tauhaki remained in grief. A full moon passed. At last he could not endure it and called to Karihi, asking him to join a search for the lost child. Karihi agreed. 2 servants came with them. On the road, Tauhaki warned the servants not to look up at a certain fortified place along the way. It was enchanted. One servant did look and immediately suffered a terrible consequence, dying on the spot. The journey continued with only one servant left. They reached the place where vines from the sky hung down toward earth. There, guarding the ends, sat an old woman who was blind. She held one of the vine ends in her hands as if it were a living rope that must never be left untended. She was counting taro roots, laid in a heap. Tauhaki approached silently and slid one root away. She counted again and found the number wrong. He removed another. Confusion grew into suspicion. The old woman reached for a weapon she kept hidden beneath her, stood and swept it around, feeling for the prankster. Tauhaki and Karihi pressed low to the ground, and the weapon passed over them. She sat again, still unsure. Then Karihi struck her face, startling her into a cry. In the next moment, Tauhaki touched her eyes, and sight returned. The old woman looked at them and recognized them as kin. She wept over them, like a grandmother who has waited too long for children to come home. When she could speak again, she asked where they were going. Tauhaki said he was searching for his daughter in the skies. The old woman listened, asked what had driven the child and her mother away, and heard that the mother belonged to the people above. She pointed to the vines and told him the road was there. But the climb should not begin late in the day. It should begin with morning. They rested. At dawn they ate to prepare for the strain ahead. Tauhaki offered the remaining servant to the old woman as payment for her help. Then she gave her instructions again. Hold tight, climb steadily, and do not look down halfway up, because dizziness and enchantment could pull a climber to death. Above all, do not grab the loose vine. Take the one that is firmly anchored. Karihi, eager, leapt too soon and seized the wrong vine. It swung him away in a terrifying arc towards the horizon. Winds seized him and hurled him back and forth through the air, tossing him as if he were weightless. Only at the right moment, guided by Tauhaki's shouted timing, did Karihi release his grip and drop back safely to earth. The brothers wept at how close he had come to dying. Tauhaki, fearing the next mistake would be fatal, told Karihi to return home and guard the families and dependents. Karihi obeyed and left. Tauhaki began the climb alone. From below, the old woman called up encouragement, urging him to keep his hands strong. As he climbed, he repeated powerful protective words, using them like a shield against the terrors of the route. At last, he pulled himself into the sky world. And then he did something unexpected. He disguised himself. The handsome warrior became, in appearance, an ugly old man. In that form he walked the paths above and entered a dense forest. There he found men, his wife's brothers and their companions, working at canoes, carving and shaping them. Seeing the ugly stranger, they mocked him and decided he would serve as a slave. They ordered him to carry heavy axes back to the village. The old man agreed and told them to walk ahead because he was slow. Once they vanished from sight, he turned back to the canoe. With a single swift run of the tool, he finished one side beautifully. He did the same to the other side, then he picked up the axes again and continued toward the village, moving like an exhausted labourer. Along the way, he encountered 2 women gathering firewood. They also mocked him, forced him to take their bundle, and marched him to the settlement carrying both axes and firewood. In the village, they boasted they had found a slave. Tango, his sky-born wife, answered from inside that he could be useful for everyone. She did not recognize her own husband under the disguise. Tauhaki walked straight toward the hearth where Tango sat with their daughter. Others tried to stop him, warning that approaching her place would be dangerous. He ignored them and set his load down near her fire. People muttered that the old man had brought trouble on himself, still unaware of who he truly was. He stayed there through the night opposite Tango, sharing the same fire with the woman who had left him. At dawn, the brothers-in-law called for him again and marched him back to the forest with the axes. They reached the canoes and stared. Another canoe was finished, beyond what they had left the day before. Confusion spread. They worked all day. In the evening, they ordered the old man to carry the axes back. Once again, he agreed. Once again, after they left, he returned and finished their work with impossible speed. This happened again. The pattern became undeniable. On the third evening, the brothers-in-law decided to hide and watch. Tauhaki overheard the plan and let it happen. When the men slipped into the bushes, the old man dropped his cloak, spoke the words that removed the disguise and revealed his true form, noble, radiant, unmistakable. He began working at the canoe as himself. Hidden observers whispered that the slave and the chief could not be the same person. Then fear and awe replaced mockery. They fled back to the village and questioned their sister, asking her to describe her husband. Her description matched the man they had seen. The truth finally took shape. When Tauhaki returned, he wore the old disguise again, testing the moment. Tango confronted him directly. She asked who he was. He moved toward her without answering. She asked again if he was Tauhaki. He gave a low assent and walked straight to their child, lifting her into his arms and holding her tightly, as if reclaiming what had been taken. The household reacted instantly. People scattered from the courtyard as though the space had become too charged to stand in. Murmurs of astonishment spread as the slave became a dazzling chief in their minds, and the humiliation of their insult settled over them. Tauhaki explained his purpose simply. He had come so their daughter could receive the rights and blessings given to children of high rank, meant to secure protection and good fortune. Tango agreed. At sunrise, they opened a new exit through the far end of the house, not using the usual doorway, marking the child's status through ceremony and movement. Prescribed prayers were spoken as she was carried out. Then she was taken to water and immersed while sacred words were recited. Hinari did not vanish the moment she hit the sea. For a long stretch of time, she drifted beyond sight of land, carried by currents that neither asked permission nor offered mercy. Months passed in that cold, moving darkness, till the surf finally threw her onto a beach at a place remembered as Wairarawa. She lay there like something the ocean had finished with. Seaweed clung to her skin, barnacles had formed along her body, and the salt had taken away the strength that once held her upright. Two brothers, Ihu Atamai and Ihu Waraware, found her in that condition. Even beneath the crust of sea growth, they could still see the outline of beauty and the signs of life that had not fully gone out. They lifted her from the sand, carried her to their home, and placed her beside a fire. Patiently, carefully, they scraped away the seaweed and the barnacles, warmed her, and watched her breathe return to a steady rhythm. When she recovered, the brothers kept her with them. In time, she became their wife, shared between them as people sometimes did in old stories, where survival and custom shaped the rules. They wanted to know who she truly was and where she came from, but she refused to give her real name. Instead, she chose a new one, calling herself Ihu Ngaru Paea, a name that suggested driftwood washed ashore, something carried far from its origin and left in a strange place. She lived under that borrowed identity for a long while, until one of the brothers, Ihu Werewe, visited a powerful chief named Tinarau, and spoke about the stranger who had come out of the sea. Tinirau did not treat the story as a simple curiosity. He went himself, took the young woman and claimed her as his own. By then, she was already carrying a child conceived with Ihu Atamai, and the time of birth was close. Tinirau brought her to his home on an island called Motu Tapu, where other wives already lived. Two of them, Harataunga and Horotata, saw the newcomer arriving at their husband's side and could not bear it. Jealousy sharpened into cruelty. They mocked her, cursed her, and pushed their anger toward violence, as if humiliation alone were not enough. Hinari endured their words until grief turned hard inside her. In the traditions that tell this story, words can be more than sound, and a wounded heart can reach for power. She spoke a sequence of charged phrases, a kind of spoken force meant to strike through the air. The moment the last sound fell, the two women collapsed and did not rise again. Whatever the explanation offered by belief, the result was the same. Tinirau was left with Hinari alone. Far away from Motu Tapu, her disappearance was not forgotten. A younger brother, once known as Māui Mua, and later called Rupe, could not let the loss settle into silence. Love for his sister kept pushing him forward when reason told him to stop. He searched across places he thought she might be found, refusing to leave gaps in his route, yet every path came back empty. Finally, he decided that the answer might lie above the human world, with an ancestor named Rehua, who lived in the upper heavens. Rupa began to climb, forcing his way upward through layered skies that others claimed were beyond reach. At each level, he met people who insisted the boundary had been fixed and could not be crossed. Yet, he pressed through again and again until he reached the highest realm spoken of in that part of the tradition. There, at last, stood Rehua's dwelling at Te Putahi Nui o Rehua. Rehua welcomed the stranger with formal morning greetings, a ritual courtesy offered even before identity was certain. Rupe replied with words and patterns that allowed Rehua to recognize him. Food was prepared in the way of that place, and Rupe saw something that looked like abundance drawn from an unexpected source. Birds nesting in Rehua's hair, then taken and cooked by servants. Rehua invited Rupe to eat, but Rupe refused. The birds had fed on what they found in the sacred hair of a being beyond ordinary rank, and the idea of consuming them filled him with fear and restraint. The food remained untouched. Rupe then asked what he had come to ask all along, whether any rumour had risen from the world below about his missing sister. Rehua answered that distant voices had carried news from Motu Tapu. That was enough. Rupe transformed into a pigeon and dropped from the upper world toward the island, moving with a speed the earlier journey had never allowed. He reached Tinirau's home and landed on the windowsill. People cried out at the sight of a strange bird and tried to kill it. A spear flew, but the pigeon turned it aside, and it snapped against the wood. They tried a snare next, but the bird kept slipping beyond the loop. Hinori watched this and felt something familiar in the way the creature moved and endured. She told the people to stop and looked closely. Recognition came like a sudden light. She spoke to the pigeon, and the bird worked its beak as if trying to speak back. She called out to Tinirau that her brother had arrived, and Tinirau asked his name. She answered, Rupe. On that same day, Hinari's child was born. Brother and sister greeted each other with formal poetic lines that carried both sorrow and relief, as if the words themselves were needed to stitch the distance closed. Then Rupa acted without delay. He took Hinari and her newborn and rose into the air, lifting them away from Motu Tapu. In the rush upward, an object meant to be buried with proper care was accidentally dropped, and the tale explains a feature of the natural world through that loss, saying that what fell was taken by a shark. and that this became the reason sharks are found with many large eggs inside them. The story moves quickly past the grief of the mistake and returns to the climb. They reached Rehua's home again. The place was not the shining perfection someone might expect from the highest sky. The courtyard was filthy, neglected by people who had grown lazy because they lived too high above consequence. Rupa was angered by what he saw and spoke sharply about servants, who would not lift a hand even if the dirt itself were alive. He made tools, wooden shovels with names given as if they were companions in the work, and he cleaned the court until it was purified. He also added to the building, improving the dwelling in his own way. Yet even good intentions can be followed by tragedy. A beam was set poorly. Rehua's son Kaitangata later grabbed it. The timber sprang, and he fell to his death. The tale says his blood stained a region of the sky, and that a red flush seen in the heavens is still linked to that event. Not long after these events, another thread begins in Tinerao's household. Tinarao wanted a ritual specialist to strengthen the destiny of his child. Tu Huruhuru, shaping the baby towards success in war and life. A man named Kai arrived to perform the needed ceremonies. When the rites were done, Tinarao called for his tame whale, Tutunui, a creature trained to come ashore at a signal. The whale obeyed, and Tinarao cut a portion of its flesh, cooked it, and served it to Kay as a feast gift. Kay praised the taste. That praise, in the logic of the story, is the start of greed. Kay soon said he needed to return home. A canoe was prepared, but he resisted, inventing reasons to delay. His true plan was simpler. He wanted to ride the whale, and he wanted more than a ride. Tinarao eventually allowed him to use Tutunui as transport, but gave strict instructions. When the whale reached shallow water and touched the bottom, it would shake, and Kay must jump off to the right side immediately. Kay agreed. The whale carried him across the sea. Near Kay's village, the whale touched the bottom and shook as promised. Kay did not dismount. He clung harder, pressing his weight down. The whale struggled, shook again and again, but the man held fast. Sand clogged the whale's breathing holes, and Tutunui died there in the shallows. Kay and his people dragged the body ashore and began cutting it up for a feast. They cooked it in earth ovens, covering the meat with fragrant leaves. The tale says the fat clung to those leaves so deeply that even later, when the same plant is burned and gives off greasy scent, people recall Tutunui's richness. Across the water, Tinarao waited for the whale's return. Time passed. Then a smell travelled over the sea, the unmistakable scent of cooked whale flesh. Tinarao and his wife knew what it meant. Kay had killed the pet whale and eaten it. Tinarao did not send warriors at first. He sent women, because women arriving by canoe would seem less like a raid and more like visitors. 40 of them set out, led by figures remembered by name. Before they departed, Tinarao explained how to identify Kay. His teeth were uneven, overlapping in a way that could not be missed, once seen. The women reached Kay's village and were received. At night, a fire was lit in the meeting house, and the visitors sat on one side while Kay's people filled the other. Kay himself sat near the main pillar where he would sleep. No one openly asked, "Which one is Kay?" because direct questioning of important names could be considered improper. Instead, the visitors used performance. Their plan was to make everyone laugh, then watch mouths as they opened, searching for the crooked teeth that would reveal the man they wanted. They performed games, music, puppet play, rhythmic competitions, and every trick meant to break a crowd into laughter. Kay stayed silent, holding his face still. Finally, they tried something more direct. A comic song delivered with exaggerated expressions and synchronized movement, designed to defeat even the most stubborn restraint. This time Kay laughed. When he opened his mouth, they saw the uneven teeth, and more than that, they saw bits of whale flesh still stuck between them. The sign was undeniable. They pretended to sleep and let the fire burn low, but their goal was to work unseen. Kay suspected danger and tried to fake wakefulness by placing shining shells in his eyes, so the faint light would reflect and make it seem he was watching. It did not save him. The women used chants to press the whole house into unnatural sleep, then formed a human chain from the sleeping place to their canoe. 2 women lifted Kay gently, wrapped as he had been, and passed him from arms to arms until he lay in the canoe, still unconscious. They paddled back across the sea to Tinirau. At Tinirau's village, they placed Kay in a sleeping position that mimicked his own, beside the central post, so his half-waking mind would accept the setting as familiar. In the morning, Tinirau ordered his people to shout as he approached, calling his name as if he were arriving at Kay's village. Hearing the cries, Kay jolted awake, confused. Tinirau sat outside and greeted him directly, then asked how he had come there. Kay tried to reverse the question, but Tinirau forced him to look around and name what he saw. For a brief moment, Kay insisted it was his own house, because he lay where he always lay, yet the structure betrayed him. When Tinirau asked where the window should be, Kay finally understood. His head bowed. He had no escape. Tinirau's people dragged him out and killed him. By the time the earlier storms of vengeance had settled into memory, 2 Huruhuru had reached adulthood. He married Apakura, and their household quickly became the kind that old traditions love to track through names and births, as if the family itself were a living map. A son was born first and called Tu Hakararo. Later came a daughter, Mairatea, and then more children followed in steady succession, Wakatau Potiki, and finally the youngest, Reimatua. The family line looked secure, yet the story turns on the simple fact that kinship does not always protect a person once they step into another tribe's home. When Mairatea grew up, she married into a powerful lineage. Her husband was the son of Popo Horokewa, a leading chief among the Ati Hapai people. She travelled with him to live among his relatives, while her brother, Tu Hakararo, stayed behind in his own community. Time passed, and distance started to feel heavier than it had at first. Tu Hakararo began to miss his sister and decided to visit her. His journey brought him to a huge communal house belonging to Popo Horokewa's people, a place where the chief's family and dependents lived together under one roof. Tu Hakararo entered as a guest and stayed among them, surrounded by unfamiliar faces who watched him closely, measuring his presence and his confidence. During that visit, a young woman named Moorea, the younger sister of Tu Hakararo's brother-in-law, took an obvious interest in him. Her attention was bold enough to cause whispers, because she was already courting a young man from her own tribe. Even so, she kept circling Tu Hakararo, drawn to him in a way that made the other suitor look smaller by comparison. In a community where reputation could rise or fall in a single afternoon, it did not take much for that tension to become dangerous. One day, the young men of the Ati Hapai challenged the visitor to wrestle. It was presented as sport, but sport in such settings can quickly become a public judgment. Tu Hakararo agreed, and the opponent who stepped forward was the very young man who believed Moorea belonged to him. The contest began, and Tu Hakararo handled his rival with humiliating ease. He threw him down hard. When they rose again, he lifted him and drove him to the ground a second time, even more violently. Laughter burst from the watching crowd. The defeated man sat there stunned, swallowing shame while everyone around him enjoyed it. What looked like entertainment had turned into a wound. Tu Hakararo finished the match and sat down to dress again, calm and unguarded, as if the moment were already over. But humiliation does not always fade when the cheering stops. While Tuakararo pulled his cloak over his head, the defeated youth rushed forward. At the exact instant Tuakararo's face emerged, a fistful of sand was flung directly into his eyes. Blinded by pain, he clawed at his face to clear the grit. That brief helplessness was all the attacker needed. A blow struck Tuakararo's head, and he fell. The visitor died there, not in a fair contest, but in the aftermath, when the crowd's laughter had already done its work. What followed was not only murder, but desecration. The people of the Ati Hapai cut up his body and ate it, treating the dead man as a conquered enemy rather than a guest who had come to see his sister. His bones were kept as proof and warning, hung up beneath the ridge of their great house. In the nights that followed, the bones sometimes knocked together in the currents of air and movement under the roof. Mairatea heard that dry rattling sound, and in her mind it seemed to form a repeated phrase, as if the remains were calling out through the darkness. She listened again and again, until she could not bear it. Looking up toward the roof, she spoke bitterly to what hung there, saying that the bones could rattle as they wished, because no one would come to mourn him properly, and no one would come to take revenge. But news travels, even across guarded distances. Word of Tuakararo's death reached his brothers. Grief struck first, then a slow, sharpening anger. Wakatao Potiki, among them, took the grief and turned it into a decision that would not bend. He would avenge Tuakararo. His people agreed, and preparation began immediately. Canoes were built, not one or two, but so many that the launching itself became a spectacle of intent. Each canoe was given a name, as if a name could anchor courage and keep a crew united, once the coast had disappeared behind them. While the men worked on hulls and lashings, Apakura and the women prepared provisions, beating fern root into portable food and keeping a lament moving through the work, a steady chant designed to harden the hearts of those who would go. The morning was not soft. It was meant to make the warriors feel the injustice again and again until hesitation became impossible. When the fleet was ready, the force embarked in a vast armada, described in the tradition as 1,000 canoes, spreading across the sea like a moving line of dark shapes. Along their route, they landed at a place where Wakatao Potiki ordered a formal review. The warriors practiced formations and feigned attacks, charging imaginary enemies, falling back, supporting one another in rolling movements of advance and retreat. It was not only training. It was a test of unity and discipline, a way to see who could hold a line and who would break when the moment came. At the edge of that gathering place lay a creek that some tried to leap, but they failed. Then the chosen band under Wakatao Potiki's direct command rose and crossed it cleanly, one after another, as if the gap did not exist. The point was made without explanation. Some people could not cross what was in front of them. Others could. The difference would matter when the real doors and real walls were in sight. After the review, Wakatao Potiki addressed the force. The attack would not be completed in daylight. The approach had to be hidden. Darkness would cover movement and preserve surprise. Then, when night arrived and the shore was swallowed by shadow, he ordered something that seemed at first like madness. His chosen men moved among the canoes and pulled the plugs from every vessel except their own. They did it carefully, canoe after canoe, missing none. When he gave the signal to embark, the entire host surged toward the water in confusion, launching craft and leaping aboard with the eagerness of men who believed the moment had finally come. And then the fleet began to sink. One canoe after another took water. Crews scrambled back to shore, shouting and cursing, forced into frantic repairs. In the chaos, the chosen band pushed off, at speed in the one set of canoes that still held firm, leaving the larger force stuck behind. That deliberate sabotage was the key to the plan. The main body could not follow closely enough to expose the surprise. Only the selected strike group would reach the target in time and silence. As they neared the settlement and the great house where Popo Horokewa's people slept, the chosen band landed and moved like a ring closing. They surrounded the structure completely, taking positions around its circumference. Each of its many doors was watched by a dedicated group, so that any attempt to escape would meet waiting blades. Outside the house they seized a man named Hioi. Wakatau Potiki questioned him quickly and precisely. Where the sister was, where Popo Horokewa slept, how he could be recognized in the dark. Hioi answered that the sister was inside, that the chief slept near the main pillar and that one broken tooth would identify him. He also pointed out where the sister lay, close to a particular doorway. Then, the questioning ended and cruelty began. Wakatau Potiki cut Hioi's tongue and forced him to attempt speech, testing how much he could still communicate. He cut again until the man could only mumble. Then, he ordered him into the house to summon the sister out. Inside, the gathered people noticed something wrong. Hioi had gone out and returned damaged, unable to form clear words. Questions rose around him, but answers would not come. Mairatia understood immediately. She saw the half-speech, the panic in the eyes, and recognized the shape of her brother's strategy. She stepped out into the night and found Wakatau Potiki waiting. Brother and sister met in the darkness and broke into quiet weeping, joy at reunion tangled with the fresh pain of two Hakararo's death. When the tears slowed, Wakatau Potiki asked what he needed to confirm. Exactly where Popo Horokewa slept. Mairatea repeated what Hioi had said, then warned that many in the house had seen her brother before and would recognize him. Wakatau Potiki asked what could be done. She chose disguise. She cut his hair short, rubbed charcoal across his face, and altered his appearance into something the household would mock rather than fear. Together they walked back into the great house. The fire inside had burned low. As they entered, people called for it to be stirred up because strangers had arrived. Flames rose brighter and faces turned toward the doorway. When they saw the soot-darkened visitor, laughter erupted. They joked about his blackened face. Even Popo Horokewa laughed, and that laughter gave away what Wakatau Potiki needed most. The chief's mouth opened, and the broken tooth showed itself clearly in the firelight. Wakatau Potiki had entered with a strong rope coiled in his hand, a noose already formed at one end. When Popo Horokewa laughed, the noose slid forward and dropped over his head before he fully understood what was happening. Wakatau Potiki hauled it tight. The cord bit into the chief's neck. In the same instant, Wakatau Potiki and Mairatia rushed out, pulling the struggling man behind them. Outside, the warriors tightened the circle. Wakatau Potiki climbed onto the roof while dragging the rope upward, speaking forceful words meant to strengthen action and crush resistance. Then, the strike group sprang up from hiding all around the house and set it ablaze in multiple places at once. Anyone who tried to flee met waiting hands and steel. The great house became a furnace. Te Uruo Manono burned, and those inside were destroyed with it. The chosen band withdrew before the wider force could stumble back into place, and they carried the news home to Apakura. 2 Wakararo had been avenged. From there, the tradition shifts to another famous cycle, one that also begins with a father's death and a son's duty. Before Tahaki's ascent into the upper world, a son named Wahiaroa had been born to him through an earlier marriage. Wahiaroa grew into adulthood, married Kura, and their child was named Rata. Wahiaroa was later killed through treachery by a chief called Matuku Takotako. Rata was born before that murder, which meant he grew up under a simple expectation. The wrong done to his father could not be left unanswered. When Rata was old enough, he announced his intent openly. He would go in search of the man who killed Wahiaroa. He travelled until he reached the entrance to Matuku Takotako's domain and found a watchman stationed there. Rata asked where the killer could be found. The watchman answered that Matuku Takotako did not live like ordinary people. He was said to dwell beneath the earth and rise at the time of the new moon, coming out to feed on human beings. Rata asked how the creature knew when to rise. The watchman explained that he called down to him, warning him when the moon was right. The new moon would appear in 2 nights. Rata was told to leave and return on the morning of the 2nd day. Rata waited, then came back as instructed. This time, he asked where he could hide so Matuku Takotako would not detect him. The watchman led him to 2 clear fountains. One was used for washing and combing wild hair, the other for looking at the face like a mirror while dressing. The watchman warned that the mirror fountain was dangerous, because it would reveal not only Matuku Takotako's reflection, but the shadow of any hidden attacker. The washing fountain was safer. That was where Rata should strike. Evening came, and the moon's change showed itself. The watchman shouted the signal that the new moon had appeared. From the ground, Matuku Takotako rose holding a heavy weapon, then moved directly to the fountains. He laid his weapon down and knelt by the water, undoing his hair bindings until long locks fell loose. He plunged his head into the clear water. At that moment, Rata crept forward from hiding. As Matuku Takotako lifted his head, Rata seized him by the hair with one hand and struck with the other, killing him before he could reach his weapon. In the logic of the story, the deed was clean and exact. The father's death had been repaid. But revenge did not complete the obligation. Rata asked for Wahiaroa's bones, the remains needed for proper rites and closure. The watchman said the bones were not there. Strangers from far away had taken them. Rata returned home and thought carefully about how to retrieve what had been stolen. His solution was to build a canoe, a vessel strong enough to reach distant enemies. He went into the forest, chose a tall straight tree, and cut it down, trimming the crown and preparing to hollow the trunk. When he left at dusk, the forest answered. Insects, birds, and unseen forest beings gathered around the fallen tree. They were enraged, not simply because a tree had been cut, but because it had been cut without proper respect. They lifted the trunk back onto its stump and restored every shaving and chip to its place, singing as they worked until the tree stood whole again. In the morning, Rata returned and found the tree upright as if nothing had happened. He cut it down again. In the evening, the forest restored it again. The pattern repeated until Rata decided to stop fighting blindly and watch. On the next attempt, he felled the tree, then pretended to leave and hid in the undergrowth. Soon he heard a rising chorus and saw the forest's workers arrive, singing while they moved. As they began restoring the tree, Rata rushed out and seized some of them, demanding to know why they had undone his work. Their reply was sharp. He had no authority to cut down the forest's living strength without the proper acknowledgements. Hearing this, Rata's anger collapsed into shame. He understood that power taken without respect invites resistance from the world itself. The forest beings told him to return home and promised to make a canoe for him. Rata obeyed. As soon as he left, they worked with astonishing speed and perfect coordination, shaping the canoe as if every hand knew its exact task from the beginning. When it was done, Rata and his people hauled it to the sea and gave it a name, Piwaru. A war party of 140 men boarded and set out to find the enemies who had taken Wahiaroa's bones. At nightfall, they reached an enemy stronghold associated with the Ponaturi. Rata went ashore alone, leaving the canoe floating with his warriors. He saw a fire burning at a sacred spot where priests performed rites. He crept closer and hid behind thick flax. From there, he watched the priests using Wahiaroa's bones as instruments, clacking them in rhythm while chanting a powerful formula. Rata listened, memorized the pattern, and waited until he was certain he could repeat it exactly. Then, he sprang from hiding, struck the priests down before they could raise an alarm, seized his father's bones, and sprinted back to the canoe. The crew paddled hard, aiming for the safety of their fortified home. In the morning, the Ponaturi discovered their dead priests and the missing bones and began pursuit at once. A large force followed Rata back across the sea and eventually reached his fortress. Battle erupted, and at first Rata's people were driven back. Many of his warriors fell. In that desperate moment, Rata used the very chant he had learned, speaking it with absolute focus. The tradition claims the fallen rose again as if pulled back from death by the force of the words, and the revived fighters surged forward. The counterattack slaughtered the Ponaturi host completely. With the enemies destroyed, Rata's obligation was finally complete. His canoe was hauled ashore and roofed, with thatch as a treasured object, protected against sun and weather like something almost sacred. Later, genealogies and parallel tellings weave Rata's line into the line of other heroes, sometimes rearranging names and parentage in ways that show how oral tradition can carry multiple versions without surrendering its core themes. One version speaks of a child named Wakatao, a figure tied to both skill in war and mastery of supernatural knowledge. His origin is described in a way that places him halfway between the sea's depth and the human world above it, as if he belonged to both. As a boy, he was known for flying kites, and people sometimes saw only the kite in the sky while the unseen hand holding the string was said to move below the water. When he finally emerged onto land, watchers tried to seize him, but he slipped back into the sea again and again until he declared that only Apakura could catch him. When she came and called out her name, he stopped running and allowed himself to be held. He told her he was her child, formed through the shaping power of a divine ancestor, and brought into life in an extraordinary way. After that, he lived on shore and grew into a renowned hero, feared for what he knew and respected for what he could do. In another strand of the wider cycle, Tinirau sought revenge for the death of his descendant, Tuhuruhuru, and judged that the most effective ally would be this same Wakatao, famous for both combat and enchantment. Tinirau sent a woman of rank, Haine Te Iwaiwa, to find him. She reached a village near the place she expected him to be, and asked where Wakatao could be found. People told her he was on a hill, flying a kite. She climbed up, met a man there, and asked again. He answered that she must have passed Wakatao on her way, a reply that confused her enough to send her back. The villagers then explained that the man on the hill had likely been Wakatao himself, and they described signs by which she could recognize him. She returned, tested what she knew against what she saw, and after a pause he admitted his identity. She delivered Tinirau's request. Warriors were gathering, but fear held them back because the enemy was formidable. Not long after his visitor departed, Wakatao summoned his people with urgency. The canoe descended from the line of Rata was to be prepared at once. Fresh sideboards were lashed into place, bindings tightened, and by the end of the day, the vessel stood ready. It was dragged down to the sea before nightfall. When darkness settled, 6 warriors stepped aboard, and Wakatao joined them as the 7th. Without delay, they paddled into open water, keeping a steady course until they reached the settlement of Tinirau. There, they found Haine Te Iwaiwa seated in her house of mourning. Wakatao asked whether the warriors had already set out. She answered that they had not. Fear held them back. He told her to remain where she was and await news. The canoe turned again toward the stronghold where the great house known as Te Tihi o Manono stood. They anchored offshore and waited for morning. At first light, villagers noticed the canoe lying beyond the defences and raised a cry of alarm. Warriors poured out and formed ranks. One of their champions, Mango Huri Tapena, stepped forward and mocked Wakatao for coming willingly into danger. Wakatao answered calmly, asking what skill the warrior claimed as his own. The man boasted of his prowess as a diver. He plunged into the sea and swam beneath the canoe. At that moment, oil was poured into the water, clearing it so completely that the diver's body could be seen rising below the hull. As he surfaced, Wakatao struck him down with a wooden blade. Another champion, Pitakataka, came forward, dismissing the first death as mere chance. He claimed mastery in leaping so high he seemed to fly. Wakatao invited him to prove it. The man ran and sprang into the air toward the canoe, but a hidden noose tightened around him as he landed, and he too was killed. One by one, other renowned fighters challenged and fell. Of 10 who stepped forward, all perished. One captive was spared but mutilated, his tongue cut so that he could return to his people, unable to speak clearly of what had happened. After this display, the canoe withdrew beyond sight. Later that day, Wakatao came ashore alone. Before taking food, he performed the required rites, offering a portion from one of the fallen to the unseen powers. Only after the ritual did he eat. Then, he sent his companions back with a message for Hinei Te Iwaiwa. He would not return with them. She was told to watch the sky. Heavy rain would mean failure and death. A fine mist, accompanied by a red glow on the horizon, would signal victory, and flames consuming Te Tihi o Manono. As evening approached, Wakatao moved toward the great house. Firewood was being gathered at the edge of a nearby forest. He slipped among the carriers and walked with them as if he belonged there. Entering the house ahead of the others, he carried a long rope. Quietly, he threaded it between the wall planks and the supporting posts, circling the entire structure, fastening one end while keeping the other in his hand. The house filled as night deepened. Fires were lit within, many of them, until the interior glowed bright. Among the crowd was the man whose tongue had been cut. They pressed him to describe the warrior who had maimed him. He insisted that none present resembled that man. Voices called out, asking whether the stranger had looked like this person or that. At last, Wakatao himself asked the question. The injured man studied him closely and admitted that he did indeed resemble the attacker. Wakatao confirmed it openly. The crowd surged to its feet in alarm, but he had already slipped outside, hauling the rope with force. The posts gave way, and the structure collapsed inward, crushing those within. Flames were set, and the house burned. From afar, Hinei Te Iwaiwa saw the sky redden and understood that vengeance had been completed. Wakatao returned home, having avenged Tuhuruhuru. Elsewhere, old rivalries were unfolding in Hawaii. Divisions had long separated different lines of descent. Conflicts traced back through generations, to quarrels over sacred matters and acts of insult. One such offence occurred when a dog belonging to the household of Humai Tauhiti committed a desecration against Unuku. The animal was killed in retaliation. Its masters searched for it from settlement to settlement until they reached Toi Te Huatahi's village. There, the truth became impossible to hide. The insult was acknowledged and resentment took root. Tama Te Kapua and his brother Wakaturia responded with mischief rather than immediate violence. By night, they stole fruit from Wenuku's prized tree, leaving only marks from the stilts used to reach the branches. Eventually they were caught. Wakaturia was seized and suspended inside Wenuku's great house, hung in the rafters above smoky fires, so that suffocation would slowly claim him. Tama Te Kapua escaped. Learning of his brother's plight, Tama Te Kapua devised a bold rescue. Under cover of darkness, he reached the roof and whispered instructions through the thatch. Wakaturia was to mock the poor quality of the dancing and singing below. Pride would compel them to bring him down to prove himself superior. He was to request oil to clean himself, feathers for ornament, and finally the red apron and carved sword of Wenuku. Once armed and dressed, he would dance toward the doorway, where Tama Te Kapua would wait to bolt the exits. The plan unfolded precisely. Wakaturia's performance dazzled the crowd. As he danced toward the door, he leapt outside. Tama Te Kapua barred the entrance, trapping those within while the brothers fled. The escape enraged Toi and Uenuku. War followed. Humaitohiti's settlement was attacked and defended fiercely. In the struggle, many fell. The victors committed a grave offence by consuming the bodies of close kin, an act that stained their honour and weakened their spirit. Eventually, peace was sought. Yet the tension of those years drove some to consider departure. In another tale connected to these migrations, Ngāhue carried a prized stone across the sea after being driven from his home. He explored distant coasts and found lands rich in resources, including stone suitable for tools and ornaments. News of this discovery stirred interest. Canoes were built from great trees, among them the Arawa and the Tainui, shaped by skilled hands and fitted for ocean travel. When the fleet was ready, Tama Te Kapua ensured that a powerful priest, Ngatoro Irangi, was aboard his own canoe by trickery. Once at sea, tensions flared. Magical knowledge was used to alter winds and currents. At one point, the canoe was drawn into a vast whirlpool, descending bow first until panic seized the crew. Through incantations, the storm was calmed and the vessel drawn back from disaster, though much of its cargo was lost. The voyagers eventually sighted land. Brilliant red blossoms along the shore were mistaken for precious ornaments and hastily admired before crumbling at a touch. They planted crops, explored coastlines, and encountered stranded whales that led to disputes between crews over rightful claims. Portages were attempted across narrow isthmuses, and rival enchantments either anchored canoes to the earth or freed them. Meanwhile, Ruayo, whose wife had been taken by Tama Te Kapua, pursued the fleet in his own vessel. He arrived first at Makatu and, through cunning and incantation, dragged the Arawa ashore while its crew slept. A confrontation followed. The two chiefs fought in single combat. Ryo prevailed, humiliating his opponent but sparing his life. Though capable of destroying the weakened crew, he chose instead to depart with his own followers. After the clash between Tama Te Kapua and Ruayo, Tama and his followers settled at Makatu. From there, their descendants gradually spread across the surrounding lands. Ngatoro Irangi did not remain idle. He journeyed widely, moving through valleys and across plains. In dry places he stamped upon the earth, and springs burst forth. In the high ranges he left unseen presences, beings later remembered as mountain spirits. When his wanderings were complete, he returned to Makatu and made his home there. Tensions did not disappear. A quarrel later arose between Tama Te Kapua and Kahumata Momoi. Because of this dispute, Tama and Ngatoro left Makatu and travelled toward Tauranga. There they encountered Taikehu, who was gathering food for them from the sea. The place became known as the fishing ground of Taikehu. From Tauranga they moved on, halting at different points along the coast. At one settlement, Tama ate slowly while his men devoured their meal with haste, and the memory of that small detail gave the place its name. At another stop, they ordered food to be cooked but did not remain to eat it, leaving their mark only in passing. They crossed rivers, set up stones to claim territory, and finally established themselves in the regions of Mohau and Hauraki. There, they remained for a time. Tama Te Kapua eventually died and was buried in that district. As he approached death, he instructed his children to return to Makatu, to renew ties with their kin. He revealed the hiding place of a treasured ear ornament and entrusted this knowledge to them. His children obeyed, and Ngātoro accompanied them back to Makatu. After burying Tama, Ngātoro underwent ritual cleansing in flowing water to remove the sacred restrictions associated with death. Later, he married Ehenga's daughter and recovered the hidden ornament exactly where Tama had described. It was during this period that Ehenga set out with hunting dogs in pursuit of kiwi. One of the dogs chased a bird toward a lake, plunging into the water and returning soaked, carrying its prey. From the wet fur and the fish the dog regurgitated, Ehenga realized there was a lake nearby that had not been known before. After completing the ceremonies required for the birth of his child, he returned to explore. He discovered first Lake Rotoiti, marking it as his own, then Lake Rotorua, whose flowing waters he also claimed. Along its shores he encountered inhabitants already living there. Rather than confront them directly, he relied on cunning. He fashioned a sacred enclosure in the brush, arranged stones and old offerings to give the appearance of long occupation, and then approached the villagers in fury, accusing them of trespass. When challenged, he led them to the false evidence. The sight of what seemed to be ancient posts and a sacred place convinced them, and they yielded the land. Some of the former inhabitants withdrew to Mokoia Island in the lake. Ngātoro again travelled inland, crossing the central plains near Taupo. Stories say that fragments of a cloak caught in the shrubs took root and grew into unusual trees. On hilltops he left further signs of his claim, invisible guardians believed to linger in those heights. Eventually he reached Taupo and gazed upon the snow-covered peak of Tongariro. Determined to climb it, he warned his companions not to eat until his return. They disobeyed, and as he ascended the mountain his strength failed. In desperation he called for fire from the distant homeland. Heat answered him, rising through the earth along a chain of volcanic places, until Tongariro itself flamed. Revived by that warmth, he descended and returned once more to Makatu. Meanwhile, the people of the Arawa had dispersed widely from their landing place. Some explored Rotorua and Taupo, others journeyed toward Wanganui and into the forests. Only a few remained at Makatu. News of the abandoned canoe reached Raumati of the Tainui. He gathered followers and advanced quietly to the river, opposite where the Arawa lay, sheltered beneath thatch. Under cover of night he hurled a flaming dart across the water. It struck the dry roofing and set it ablaze. By dawn the canoe had been reduced to ashes. The settlement stood empty. Its people were scattered gathering food during a season of abundance. When they saw the glow in the sky, some believed it was merely a village fire. Only later did they learn the truth. The destruction of the Arawa reopened old wounds and stirred debate. Some argued for restraint, recalling the counsel of their elder, Humai Tahiti, who had urged them to abandon war and live in peace in their new land. Yet anger prevailed, and conflict with the Tainui followed. Far away in Hawaii, events were unfolding that would soon affect these settlers. Manaya, husband of Ngātoro's sister, Kuiwai, held a gathering to remove sacred restrictions. During the feast, food prepared by Kuiwai was found undercooked. In anger, Manaya struck her and uttered a curse invoking her brother's name. Humiliated and grieving, Kuiwai prepared for retaliation. She consulted her gods and sent her daughter across the sea to warn Ngātoro. The journey was guided not by canoe, but by divine assistance. The women crossed the ocean, landed first on a volcanic island, then reached the mainland and travelled inland through forests and plains, naming places as they went. After many hardships, they arrived at Ngatoro's dwelling. When Ngatoro heard of the curse, he and his people performed cleansing rites in running water. They dug a ritual pit and symbolically cast the spirits of their enemies into it. Then he resolved upon vengeance. With no canoe remaining since the burning of the Arawa, they sought a great fallen tree and fashioned from it a new vessel. With 140 warriors, they sailed back across the ocean, concealed their arrival, and learned of Manaya's habits. At dawn, they lay bleeding in the sacred ovens as if already slain, tricking Manaya's priests into believing their spells had succeeded. When the moment came, they sprang up, slew the priests first, then overwhelmed the settlement. Manaya escaped but was pursued again at a river crossing, where another battle ended in slaughter. Eventually, Ngatoro returned to Aotearoa and established a fortified village on Mutiti Island. Manaya, still alive, later launched a final assault by sea. He challenged Ngatoro openly, proposing battle at dawn. During the night, Ngatoro invoked the winds. A storm of extraordinary violence rose, smashing canoes against the shore. By morning, Manaya and his host lay dead, their bodies scattered by waves. Signal fires summoned allies from Maketu to witness the aftermath. Thus, the curse was answered. Another tale from this era tells of Hatupatu and his brothers. While the elder men hunted and hoarded the finest food, Hatupatu was left with scraps. Resentment grew. One day he consumed the stored delicacies himself and staged a scene to suggest an enemy raid. His deception was discovered, and his brothers killed him, burying him among feathers. His parents, suspecting foul play, sent out a spirit to search for him. Through enchantment, he was restored to life and embarked upon a series of adventures, including escape from the formidable Kurangai-tuku, whose pursuit ended at the geothermal springs of Rotorua. Hatupatu eventually returned home in secret, hiding in a food store while listening to his brother's conversations. When he revealed himself, he appeared transformed into a figure of striking presence. In combat, he defeated his brothers and later joined them in an expedition against Raumanti, the man responsible for burning the Arawa. Although denied command, Hatupatu created the illusion of a great division by arranging cloaks and routes to resemble warriors. The enemy feared this phantom force. In the ensuing battle, Hatupatu slew Raumati and concealed his head until the moment of triumph. His father elevated him in honor above his elder brothers. The story begins in Hawaii in a time when old alliances were fragile and insults were never forgotten. Turi, later remembered as the founding ancestor of the Wanganui people, was drawn into a chain of violence that would eventually drive him across the ocean. A relative of Turi, Hoimatua, had a young son named Potiki Roroa. One day, the child was sent to the high priest and chief Uenuku to announce that an offering had been prepared for the gods, of which Uenuku was to receive his portion. As the boy entered the sacred house, he stumbled in the doorway. To fall at such a threshold was considered a terrible omen. Uenuku, enraged by what he saw as a sign of misfortune and disrespect, seized the child and killed him, consuming him without ceremony. The act was brutal and deliberate. Turi could not allow such a deed to pass unanswered. He searched for a way to repay the death of the child. At last, he decided that the only fitting response was to take the life of Uenuku's own son, Hawe Potiki. He first tried to lure the boy by arranging games among the children under his protection, hoping curiosity would draw him in. The plan failed. Later, during the heat of summer, he ordered the children to bathe in the river Waimatuhi Rangi. The sight of boys splashing and swimming proved irresistible. Hauipatiki joined them, and Turi struck swiftly. The boy was killed, and vengeance was taken. The heart of Hauipatiki was cut out and shared among Turi and his companions. Soon afterward, baskets of food were sent to Uenuku as part of the usual tribute. Hidden among the baked sweet potatoes was the heart of his own son. Uenuku, grieving and unaware of the truth, remarked that his boy would once have sat beside him to enjoy such a feast. Only after the meal was he told what he had eaten. He did not cry out or rage. Instead, he uttered a proverb promising future revenge and concealed his grief. Not long after, Turi's wife Rongo Rongo overheard Uenuku chanting a call to arms in his sacred house. The words summoned tribes from north and south and spoke of destroying enemies who had devoured one greater than themselves. She repeated the chant to her husband. Turi understood at once. The net was tightening. He went to his father-in-law, Toto, and asked for a canoe to escape the coming retaliation. Toto had once split a great tree from Lake Waiharakeke into 2 vessels. One was called Matahorua, the other Aotie. Matahorua had already voyaged widely under the leadership of Kupe. Aotie was given to Turi and Rongo Rongo. Kupe himself had once fled Hawaii after treachery. He had lured his companion Hoturapa into diving for a fouled fishing line, then cut the anchor rope and sailed away with Hoturapa's wife. Pursued by vengeance, Kupe crossed the ocean in Matahorua and circled the islands later known as New Zealand, mapping their coasts and inlets. He battled a great sea creature that rose against him in the straits, destroying it through cunning rather than brute force. Having explored the land and found it empty of human settlement, he returned to Hawaii. Now, as Turi prepared to depart under cover of night, Kupe heard the grinding of the canoe against the sand and approached. He advised Turi to keep the prow pointed toward the rising sun and described a river on the western coast that would mark a suitable home. Turi invited Kupe to join him, but Kupe declined, asking whether he himself would ever return to that distant land. The canoe Aotie was loaded with seeds of sweet potato, stones of karaka berries, edible rats kept in boxes, parrots, water hens, and treasured tools. Turi persuaded his brother-in-law, Tuau, to paddle out with him a short distance. Once beyond the harbour mouth, he refused to turn back, carrying Tuau unwillingly into exile. At dawn, a crew member named Tapo defied Turi and was cast into the sea. When he called out cheerfully from the water, it was taken as a sign of divine protection, and he was hauled back aboard. Midway through the voyage, the canoe's lashings loosened and water poured in. The crew bailed desperately while Turi recited protective incantations. They reached a small island where they repaired the vessel. There, they sacrificed a dog to appease offended spirits. A dispute then arose between Turi and another chief, Patoru, over which direction to sail. Ignoring Kupe's instructions, Patoru insisted on turning west. His canoe was soon wrecked on a reef, and he was lost, remembered as a warning against stubbornness. Turi resumed an easterly course. In mid-ocean, his child Tutawa was born. With only 9 sweet potatoes remaining, he sacrificed one and touched it to the infant's lips in blessing. As land came into view, some of the crew threw their faded red plumes into the sea, mistaking coastal blossoms for ornaments. When they landed, they discovered footprints in the sand, those of Tuanui Atira, whom Turi had earlier thrown overboard. His twisted foot made him unmistakable. Leaving the canoe in the harbour that would bear its name, Turi travelled along the coast, seeking the river described by Kupe. As he moved, he named places after events along the journey. Rivers for the way he forded them. Plains for encampments. Headlands for moments of rest or mishap. Reaching the river Patea, he built a fortified settlement, raised posts, constructed storehouses, and began cultivation. From 8 sweet potatoes, carefully divided and planted under sacred protection, a harvest of hundreds of baskets was gathered. From Turi and Rongo Rongo descended the Wanganui and Ngati Ruanui peoples. Another migration followed a different grievance. In Hawaii, Manaya summoned neighbouring tribes to help fashion spears. While he fished at sea, the gathered men violated his wife Rongo Tiki. A fish he hooked by the tail signalled betrayal. He returned silently, confirmed the insult, and plotted revenge. Feigning goodwill, he encouraged his offenders to make heavy spears, knowing they would be unwieldy in battle. Lying in ambush, he attacked. His son Tu'urenui hesitated, but another youth, Kahukakanui, rushed forward and struck the first blow, revealing himself as Manaya's son. Retaliation from the slain chief's kin followed. Warfare thinned Manaya's people. At last, he resolved to abandon the land. He prepared a canoe called Toko Maru. Refusing to accompany him, his brother-in-law was lured into deep water and killed as a sacrifice to secure the voyage. Manaya sailed with his family and followers into the open sea. Far from land, his dog began to howl and struggle. Released, it swam ahead and eventually reached shore beside a stranded whale. Guided by the dog's cries, Manaya's canoe made landfall at Aoti. They built shelters and began to clear ground. Soon another canoe arrived and claimed the whale and encampment as their own. After dispute and inspection of sacred markers, Manaya conceded the claim and moved on. He travelled along the coast, leaving his god, Rake Ora, at Tonga Porutu, exploring rivers and headlands, and eventually settling at the mouth of the Waitara River. There, his followers encountered earlier inhabitants and drove them out, securing the land for themselves. Manaya became remembered as the ancestor of Ngati Awa, a warrior whose conflicts in Hawaii had set in motion a voyage across the sea and a new beginning in a distant land. A visitor once sat beside a warm spring on Mokoia Island, looking out across Lake Rotorua. A local guide pointed to the rocks and asked him to take in the view, not only with his eyes, but with his imagination. The guide explained that this ledge, right where the water steams and the stones stay warm even on cold nights, is remembered as the place where a famous young woman rested after an impossible swim. From there, the guide began to tell the story as people around the lake have told it for generations. On Mokoia lived a high-ranking household shaped by complicated loyalties. Rangi Uru was the mother of a young chief named Tutanekai. Her marriage history was tangled, and the community never forgot it. She had first belonged to Wakawe, a powerful leader whose descendants later formed a major group around Rotorua. With him, she had several sons. Then, during a period when visiting chiefs moved between districts and hospitality created dangerous opportunities, she left with another renowned leader, Tuharatoa. From that relationship came Tutanekai, a child whose parentage was whispered about and sometimes used as an insult. Later, Rangi Uru returned, and her household expanded again with more children, including a daughter named Tupa. However messy the past had been, the family lived together on Mokoia, and Tutanekai was raised among his older brothers, growing up inside the same fortified world, trained for adulthood, status, and rivalry. Across the lake on the mainland lived Hainamoa, celebrated not only for beauty but for rank and a carefully guarded reputation. Her family treated her like a prize that could shape alliances, and they refused to promise her to just anyone. Yet public gatherings still brought people together. Ceremonies, feasts, and meetings where young chiefs watched each other from a distance and measured what was possible. Over time, a quiet attraction grew between Hainamoa and Tutanekai. It was not declared openly, because both sides feared rejection and humiliation. In that world, one wrong move could become gossip, and gossip could become a weapon. During this period, Tutanekai built a raised platform on the hillside above the settlement on Mokoia, a place where sound could travel cleanly over the lake at night. He spent long evenings there with a close companion named Tiki. The two were known for music rather than boasting. One played a long flute-like instrument, the other a smaller one with a sharper tone. In calm weather, the melodies drifted over Rotorua's dark water and reached the far shore. In the village of Ohata, Haine Moa listened. Night after night, the music returned like a signal. It was not an announcement, not a challenge, not a war call, but it still carried meaning. In her mind, the sound belonged to a particular person, and that certainty made the distance feel smaller than it was. Still, neither side dared to act quickly. Tutanekai hesitated, suspecting that his birth story might make him unwelcome. Hinenemoa hesitated too, knowing her family would tighten their grip if they sensed her intentions. Yet after many meetings and many silent exchanges in crowded gatherings, a message was finally sent. When it reached her, Hinenemoa understood that the feeling was mutual. The recognition did not solve the problem, but it turned longing into a plan. Back on Mokoia, one evening brought the tension into the open. In the warm house where men talked late into the night, Tutanekai's older brothers argued over Hinenemoa, each claiming he had seen signs that she might favour him. When Tutanekai said he had touched her hand and felt the answer in her grip, the response was sharp. One brother mocked him, calling him low-born and unworthy. Tutanekai did not back away. He stated that an arrangement already existed and that a sign had been agreed upon. Hinenemoa had asked how she would know when to move. His answer had been simple. The night music would be the marker, and its source would guide her to the right shore. The music continued. The signal was there. The obstacle was the lake itself. Hinenemoa's relatives suspected something and began to control the canoes. Each evening, every canoe was hauled up and kept out of reach, leaving the shoreline empty and watched. For many nights she could only listen while the sound pulled at her patience and her pride. At last, she decided that waiting would never change anything. If there was no canoe, there would be another way. On a chosen night, she gathered large dry gourds, empty and light, and tied them together as floats. With those makeshift supports, she went down to the water, stripped off her clothing, and entered the lake in darkness. The swim was long, cold, and disorienting. At one point, she reached a half-submerged stump and clung to it to regain breath, her arms burning from effort. She pushed off again, drifting when she had to, swimming when she could, unable to rely on moonlight or landmarks. The only direction came from sound, the distant melody rising from the island. That music, steady and familiar, became her compass. Hours later, she reached Mokoia. Near the landing point, a hot spring bubbled beside the lake, separated from it by a narrow shelf of stone. She slid into the warm water to stop the shaking in her limbs. The cold of the crossing still lived in her skin, and another kind of fear arrived with it. The awareness that the moment she left the spring, she would no longer be hidden by distance. She stayed low under the rock ledges, letting the heat restore her strength. Not far away, Tutanekai felt thirsty and told a servant to bring water. The servant walked down to the lake and filled a calabash near the hot spring. From the shadows, Hinenemoa spoke in a roughened voice, disguising herself as a stranger. She asked who the water was for. When she heard the name Tutanekai, she demanded the drink for herself. The servant, confused but cautious, handed it over. After she drank, she dropped the vessel and shattered it against the stones. The servant protested, but she gave no answer. He returned to the house and explained that the container had been broken by someone in the bath. Tutanekai sent him back with another calabash. The same exchange happened again. The same question, the same name, the same demand, the same deliberate breaking. One after another, the vessels were ruined. Each time the servant returned with less patience and more anxiety, and each time Tutanakai's irritation rose. Finally, he could no longer tolerate the insult. He pulled on clothing, took up a club, and marched toward the hot spring, calling out for the person who had dared to destroy his property. In the instant his voice carried across the steam, Haine Moa knew she had reached the end of her journey. She hid deeper under the rock shelf, not as an attempt to escape, but as a final moment of modest resistance, forcing him to search and find her with his own hands. He moved along the edge of the spring, feeling through darkness and mist, until his fingers closed around a hand. He demanded to know who it was. The answer came first in a quiet claim, then in a clearer voice, Hine Moa. The recognition turned anger into disbelief. The threat in his posture softened. He asked her to come with him, and she agreed. She rose from the hot water and stepped onto the ledge, exhausted but composed, and he wrapped garments around her and brought her to his house. By the customs of the community, the decision was made. The lake crossing ended as marriage. When morning arrived, the village began its ordinary routine. Fires were lit and food was prepared, but Tutanekai did not appear. Wakawe, the elder who held the household together, wondered if something was wrong and sent a man to check. The messenger slid open the window panel and saw 2 people lying inside. He returned in shock, speaking of what he had seen without naming it. Sent back again, he looked more carefully and recognized Haine Moa. The news spread across the settlement in a rush of shouts. Jealousy flared among the older brothers, who refused to believe it until the couple appeared outside, side by side, visible proof that the impossible swim had become real. The story did not end with that union. Tiki, the friend who had played music on the platform night after night, returned home heavy with disappointment, feeling left behind by the happiness he had helped create. Tutanekai noticed the change and spoke openly about it. He asked that his sister Tupa be given to Tiki as a wife, not as a reward, but as a way to restore balance and honour the bond between companions. The request was accepted, and Tiki's loneliness was answered with a place in the same extended family network. Around Lake Rotorua, descendants continued to tell the story as proof of devotion and determination. A young woman denied a canoe, a night swim guided only by music, a meeting beside a steaming spring, and a household that had to accept what it could not prevent. In the telling, the rocks by the hot water remained more than scenery. They became a physical reminder that the past is not only spoken, but also anchored to places where people still sit, listen, and imagine the sound carrying across the lake. Hotu Nui is remembered as one of the ocean crossing leaders who reached Aotearoa in the Great Canoe Migrations. The canoe tied to his name is the Tai Nui, and the first place associated with his early life on these shores is the harbour of Kauai. From there, his story turns inland. He eventually leaves the west coast behind, walks across the ranges and settles in Hauraki, making his home at a place known as Waka Tiwai. In later tradition, he becomes a leading figure there, not only a newcomer, but someone who reshapes local authority by staying, marrying again, and founding a line that will spread through the region. The reason he abandons Kauai is not a battle or a famine, but something smaller and more humiliating. A theft, a mistake of timing, and a public accusation that stains his name. One night, near midnight, a storehouse of kumara belonging to another chief is robbed. At almost the same moment, Hotu Nui steps out of his own house. When morning comes, people follow a trail. Footprints along the same path the thief used, and scattered kumara dropped as the stolen load was carried away. Hotunui's feet are said to be large, and in the damp earth his tracks overlap the lighter marks beneath them. The result is predictable. The evidence looks simple to those who want an answer quickly, and suspicion falls on the wrong man. Whether anyone truly believed it, or whether the accusation was useful politics, the effect is the same. Hotunui is shamed in front of the community. At that very time, his wife is pregnant, though the child has not yet been born. Hotunui has already prepared his fields. The soil is worked, the ground is ready, seed is set aside. Yet the accusation makes him feel as if the work is now pointless, as if the land itself has become a reminder of disgrace. Before leaving, he speaks to his wife with the kind of careful instruction that people repeat long after the speaker is gone. If the baby is a boy, he says, name him Maru Tuahu. If the baby is a girl, name her Pare Tuahu. Either name will carry the same meaning, a plot prepared for planting, remembered not for its harvest, but for the moment it was abandoned. Then, Hotunui leaves Kauai and disappears eastward, walking into a new life in Hauraki. In Hauraki, he establishes himself at Waka Tiwai and takes another wife, connected to a chief named Te Watu. From this second marriage, he has a son named Paka. Meanwhile, back in Kauai, the child from the first marriage is born and receives the name that preserves the story. Maru Tuahu grows up hearing that his father lives somewhere beyond the sunrise, across forests and ridgelines, in a different district with different people. When Maru Tuahu reaches adulthood, he does what many sons in these traditions do. He decides to look for the father who left. He takes a weapon suited for hunting birds and travels with a servant through wooded country where food can be gathered on the way. The journey is not quick. It lasts weeks, and the landscape itself becomes part of the test. At last, he reaches the edges of the Hauraki forests, near Kohu Kohu Nui early one morning. At the same time, two young women are approaching along the same path from the opposite direction. They are daughters of Te Watu. One is described as strikingly beautiful, the other less admired. They see the servant sitting beneath a tree, notice a fine cloak lying on the ground, and begin joking about claiming him as a servant. Their laughter is light, but it also reveals confidence. They are young women of status, accustomed to speaking as if the world will answer. Above them, hidden among the branches, Maru Tuahu is spearing birds. He watches as the sisters argue playfully, each trying to claim the servant first. When they ask where the master is, the servant refuses to explain. The cloak and the pile of birds suggest a hunter nearby, and the proof arrives when a bird cries out from the canopy. The younger sister looks up and sees a young chief among the high boughs. In the playful boldness of youth, she calls out that he should be her husband. The older sister protests, claiming him too, and the rivalry shifts from servant to master in an instant. Maru Tuahu climbs down and greets them in the customary way, touching nose to nose, then agrees to follow them to their village. Yet he asks them to go ahead first, while he and his servant remain behind for a short time. Once the sisters are gone, he turns this pause into a transformation. He washes, combs his hair with care, and adorns himself with a dazzling display of feathers, including red kaka plumes and rare ornaments that signal rank. He layers his clothing in the style of a high chief, not dressing for vanity alone, but for a first meeting that will shape his future. When the sisters return to escort him, they find a different man from the one they assumed was a forest traveller. The change deepens their fascination, and they urge him forward with renewed excitement. As they walk, the sisters become curious about who he truly is. They question the servant, who answers indirectly at first, asking whether the fame of a certain Western chief has reached Hauraki. They admit that they have heard of Maru Tuahu, the son of Hotunui. The servant confirms it. The discovery reshapes their mood. They realize the stranger is not merely handsome, but significant, and significance changes everything. The younger sister breaks into a run, racing ahead to the village to announce the arrival. She calls out to Hotu Nui that his son is coming, urging the household to prepare a proper welcome. When Maru Tuahu approaches the settlement, people climb the palisades and gather at the gates. Women wave their cloaks, voices rise in greeting, and the village turns toward him like a single body. Hotu Nui steps forward and welcomes him publicly, speaking not as an accused exile, but as a father receiving a son who has crossed distance by choice. Maru Tuahu replies with studied humility, presenting himself as a young man who has come from the forests and has no grand speech to offer in a chief's presence. Yet the careful restraint carries its own power, and the meeting is sealed by food and ceremony. Beneath the celebration, the sisters continue their private contest. The younger one ultimately becomes Maru Tuahu's wife. The older sister, angry and embarrassed, confronts the outcome, believing she's been overlooked unfairly. Maru Tuahu's preference is clear, and the older sister's disappointment turns into open resentment. To restore balance, the household arranges another marriage. Paka, Hotu Nui's younger son by his second wife, takes the older daughter as his wife. In this way, both sisters are married into the same extended network, and rivalry is transformed into kinship. From Maru Tuahu and the younger daughter come 3 children, Tamatepo, Tamatera, and Wanaunga, names that later traditions link to the emergence of major tribal lines in Hauraki. From Paka and the older daughter comes a daughter named Te Kahu Reremoa, whose story will take on a life of its own, remembered as an account of pride, shame, and relentless movement. Before that, however, Maru Tuahu learns something that darkens his mood. Hotu Nui tells his son about the insults he has endured among certain people of Hauraki. The incident is described through an everyday request that becomes a public humiliation. One day, after canoes return loaded with fish, Hotu Nui sends a servant down to ask the owner of the nets for a share. The fisherman responds with a curse, mocking Hotu Nui as if he is too useless to make his own nets, and too entitled to ask others for food. The insult is not only personal, it is political. It is an attempt to reduce the standing of a chief by treating his needs as begging. Maru Tuahu listens and grows cold. He does not argue on the spot. Instead, he begins preparing. Over a long season, he catches and dries huge quantities of fish, and works with his men to produce many nets. Winter passes into spring, spring into summer, and only later are the preparations complete. When everything is ready, he sends a messenger to the very group that insulted his father, inviting them to a feast and asking them to help stretch the great nets. They accept. They say they will arrive soon. The feast is arranged in rows so it looks abundant at first glance. Fish is piled high on the surface, but beneath it the display is deliberately deceptive. Rotting wood and filth concealed under the top layer. The invitation is a trap built out of appearance and appetite. When the guests arrive, close to 1,000 of them, they sit down pleased by what they see, imagining a generous host and a profitable day. Maru Tuahu's party is far smaller, around 140, but they have something the guests do not, a plan. That night, the nets and ropes are soaked to make the fibres pliable. In the morning, the visitors begin stretching the massive net across the ground, pegging it down and fixing weights, working hard while Maru Tuahu's people prepare food nearby. When word comes that the net is fully set at the lower edge, Maru Tuahu gives his next order. His men approach, each carrying a hidden weapon beneath clothing. They lift the upper edge of the net together as if continuing the work, raising it high, moving forward and then bringing it down over the crowd. At the shouted signal, the net falls, pinning the visitors as if they themselves have become the catch. In the struggle that follows, those trapped cannot move freely, and Marutuahu's smaller force kills them systematically. The tradition claims no one escapes, and none of Marutuahu's men are lost. The place later receives a new name linked to what happened there, and the episode becomes a proverb about a feast of rotten wood, a warning that generosity can be a disguise and that insults against a chief can return in extreme form. After this massacre, the country of the dead becomes the possession of Marutuahu and his heirs. The story frames it as conquest through deception, justified by revenge and the need to assert chiefly authority. It is also a portrait of how power is narrated in these traditions. Not only through open battles, but through staged encounters, social humiliation, and dramatic reversals that become moral lessons. Around the same time, Te Kahu Reremoa, the daughter of Paka, reaches marriageable age, and a new set of visitors arrives from Great Barrier Island. They bring a huge gift of fish, baskets and baskets of mackerel, and the friendship between groups grows so strong that a marriage alliance is proposed. Te Kahu Reremoa is meant to marry the son of the visiting chief, and her father's calculations are not hidden. A daughter's marriage could become a path to influence and land for future descendants. But Te Kahu Reremoa refuses to leave. The visitors depart without her, promising they will return. A month later, they come back with more fish. Te Kahu Reremoa runs down to the shore and reaches for a basket. Her father stops her in front of everyone and scolds her sharply. He reminds her that she rejected the opportunity to live where such food is plentiful, and therefore she has no right to claim it now. The rebuke is public, and the shame hits her like a blow. She drops the fish and runs back to the house sobbing. Pride, anger, and humiliation twist into a decision. She will disappear from her father's sight. Her mind turns to a different man, a powerful chief named Taka Kopiri, known for rich lands and abundant stores, preserved birds, eels, fish, and every sign of prosperity. The choice is not presented as romance alone, but as escape into a life where scarcity and scolding will not define her. That night, while others sleep, she runs. A female servant goes with her. At dawn, the village discovers she is gone and sends pursuers, but the tracks sink into the ground in a way that makes timing hard to judge. Te Kahu Reremoa moves fast, passing named places and crossing rivers as the day opens. She reaches the Piako, gets beyond the last point where she can easily be followed, and the rising tide breaks the pursuit. Then, chance turns into assistance. Canoes from upriver see her and recognize her immediately. They shout her name as if it is both greeting and alarm, and she steps into a canoe. The paddlers, unsettled at carrying such a high-ranking young woman, pull hard and keep their heads lowered, almost afraid to look at her directly. They stop for a night, cross ridges, and continue toward the coast. From a height, she looks down toward Kati Kati and the wider Tauranga area. She asks questions she already knows the answers to because hearing the names out loud makes the destination feel real. The mountain's name, whether the country is rich in food, who owns it. The people accompanying her speak with respect of Otawe's abundance and of Takakopiri's authority, explaining that food gathered from those lands is brought to him. Te Kahu Reremoa declares she is going there. To prevent interference, she claims she is only carrying a message from her father inviting Taka Kopiri to visit. A polite lie to keep her path open. When she reaches Kati Kati, people gather in excitement. They feed her, light fires, and entertain her with dancing. She is urged to dance as well. And when she does, the crowd reacts with amazement, praising her grace. Her movements are described as fluid, almost like swimming, and the performance charms the young men of the settlement. One of the local chiefs approaches her with a marriage proposal that same night. She refuses him without discussion. Instead, she rises with her servant and flees into the dark, crossing a river immediately to escape, leaving the rejected suitor humiliated. She continues toward Tauranga, resting briefly when needed, but driven forward by determination. At the base of Otawa, she sleeps, then resumes at first light. On that same morning, Takakapiri is in the forest, pursuing birds. A tree heavy with berries draws pigeons in flocks. The two women hear a bird struck and dropping, then find a pile of freshly killed pigeons beneath the tree. They sit near them, and Takakapiri watches from above, noticing details that reveal they are travellers from far away. Cloaks, worn for journeying rather than local display. He climbs down. The servant recognizes him immediately and tells her, mistress, who resists believing it for a moment, as if naming him might collapse the distance too quickly. But it is him. Greetings are exchanged, formal and controlled. Takakapiri invites them to his settlement beyond the forest. As they walk, he urges speed, speaking impatiently, which makes Te Kahu Reremoa suspect he still does not know who she is. She slows deliberately, adjusting her clothing off the path, creating a moment for him to question the servant. Once they are out of her hearing, he asks directly. The servant answers plainly, Te Kahu Reremoa, daughter of Paka. The name lands like a shock. Takakapiri stops at once and decides to wait for her properly, aware that he has been urging a high chieftainess like a stranger on the road. When she catches up, he still presses forward, but now with urgency shaped by excitement rather than impatience. As soon as he can see his fortress, he begins shouting her name to his people. Some think he is speaking out of obsession, imagining the woman he desires. Others begin to believe because he will not stop calling it. The settlement pours out onto the defences and through the gates. They sing a welcome that frames her arrival as something from beyond the horizon, almost unreal. People beg her to stop at their houses as she passes, but no one dares speak of marriage in front of their chief. Takakapiri leads her straight through the crowd into his own dwelling. Food is set down in abundance. The village watches her late into the evening, captivated, treating her presence as an event. Within a month, she becomes Takakapiri's wife. She bears a daughter named Tuparahaki, and later generations trace leading lines through her. In the way these stories are told, Te Kahu Reremoa's flight becomes proof that pride can turn into movement, and movement can redraw a map of alliances. The final account shifts away from chiefs and marriages into the uneasy world of ritual power. Along the Waikato River lived a man named Kiki, remembered as a fearsome practitioner of magic. Stories say his influence was so dangerous that he avoided sunlight, because even his shadow could ruin what it touched. Plants would wither, places would become forbidden, and strangers could die simply from his presence. In these tales, he does not need to lift a weapon. He can slide open a door or a window shutter, and the life in passing canoes fails as if seized by an unseen hand. As Kiki's reputation spreads, a chief from Kauai named Tamure decides to confront him, not with armies but with skill. He chooses his timing carefully and travels with only a few companions, including his young daughter. They cross the ranges, reach the Waipa River, and paddle down toward Kiki's village. Before they land, Tamure performs protective rites, spoken formulas meant to shield him, call helpful forces near, and block harmful ones. Only after these protections are completed does he step ashore. Kiki welcomes them and has food prepared in a special oven. Food meant not as hospitality, but as a weapon. When the meal is laid out, Kiki invites Tamure to eat. Tamure refuses to touch it. He claims his daughter is hungry and lets her eat instead. But she eats in a controlled way, taking small bites and letting most of the food fall or disappear under her clothing, while continuing the same protective recitations her father has been using. Kiki waits, expecting the enchanted meal to do its work. Nothing happens. Tamura remains outside the doorway, quietly working his own counterspell into the threshold and doorframe, turning the house itself into a trap. When Tamur finally leaves, he does so quickly. Downriver, he stops at a settlement and gives the people a simple instruction. If pursuers ask how far his canoe has gone, tell them it is already far away. Not long after, Kiki becomes violently ill, and his people realize Tamure's magic has struck. They launch a canoe to chase him, but the villagers follow Tamure's instruction and mislead them. Believing the gap is too great, the pursuers turn back. Kiki dies, defeated not in open combat but by the careful timing of ritual words and deception. On a hill later remembered as the Sacred Mount, a carved human head was said to hold such force that no one dared approach it. The fortress where it was kept stood high above the surrounding land, and fear alone guarded its slopes. People believed the head was alive with unseen power. Those who came too near would fall under its influence and never return. Because of that reputation, the hill itself became forbidden ground. Two sorcerers, Puarata and Tautohito, lived there with the carved head. Stories about its strength spread far beyond their district. From Tamaki to Kaipara, from the tribes of Ngapuhi in the north to Waikato, Kauai, Mokau, Hauraki, and Tauranga, tales circulated of a relic so potent that even large war parties had perished trying to seize it. Some hoped to destroy it, others imagined capturing it and using its power for their own lands. None succeeded. Armed warriors and peaceful travellers alike died along the forest track near Waimatuku. Their bodies lay scattered along the path, and the smell of death became part of the story. The mounting losses alarmed the country. Eventually news reached Hakawau, a renowned master of ritual knowledge. Confident in his own command of unseen forces, he declared he would confront the hill and the men who guarded it. Before setting out, he entered a trance, calling upon the powers he believed served him. In that state he saw a towering spirit aligned with him, its head touching the sky while its feet stood firmly on earth. Interpreting this as a sign of victory, he prepared to travel. Hakawau chose a coastal route and took only one companion. They moved through settlements without resting, refusing food and comfort, and pressed steadily toward the sacred mount. As they neared the fatal stretch of Waimatuku, the air carried the stench of decomposing bodies. Both men felt dread. The companion's fear grew stronger with every step, yet Hakawau continued murmuring protective chants. He believed that if hostile spirits guarded the fortress, his own summoned forces would counter them. They crossed the deadly ground alive. From low hills they could finally see the fortress rising on Puketapu. Hakawau paused and began another ritual. He sent invisible forces ahead of him, instructing some to attack openly and others to wait. According to the tradition, the spirits guarding Puarata's stronghold rushed out to meet the first wave. When they pursued what seemed like retreating enemies, the second wave stormed the fortress left, exposed. One by one, the defenders were overwhelmed. By the time the hostile spirits realized what had happened, they were surrounded and destroyed. With the unseen guardians gone, Hakawau walked directly toward the stronghold. Puarata, sensing danger, appealed to the carved head. He cried out for it to unleash its voice as it had in earlier times, when the sound alone was said to kill intruders. But the head answered only with a low, weakened wail. Its power had already been broken. Hakawau and his companion advanced unharmed. At the entrance, Hakawau chose to climb over the gateway instead of passing through it, a deliberate act of defiance against the sanctity of the place. The inhabitants protested angrily, insisting he use the proper path. He ignored them and stepped into spaces considered sacred. Food was prepared for the visitors, but after resting briefly, Hakawau announced he would leave. As he departed, he struck the threshold with his hands. Moments after he and his companion passed beyond the walls, every person within the fortress fell dead. The reign of Puarata and his feared relic ended abruptly. Another account speaks of Kahukura, a traveller drawn northward by curiosity. While passing a shoreline, he noticed fish remained scattered on the sand. The signs suggested that whoever had fished there worked during the night. No ordinary camp debris lay about, and the footprints did not resemble those of known neighbours. Kahukura suspected that fair beings, not human fishers, had been there. He returned at night to observe. As darkness deepened, he heard voices, men, women, children, singing while hauling a net. Pale figures moved along the shore, working swiftly. Kahukura blended into their ranks, helping to pull the net. Because of his light complexion, he was not immediately recognized as human. As dawn approached, he delayed them by repeatedly tying his fish string poorly so it would spill its catch, forcing others to help him. When daylight finally revealed his identity, the fair beings scattered in alarm, abandoning their net. From that net, Kahukura learned the technique of weaving fishing nets, which he later taught to his people. A separate tradition recalls Te Kanawa, a chief who once camped on a mountain while hunting. At night, he and his companions heard approaching voices, though no forms were visible. The unseen visitors circled the fire, retreating whenever flames flared and returning when the light dimmed. Te Kanawa sensed they were fair beings. To placate them, he removed valuable ornaments of greenstone and shark tooth, and offered them. The fair beings took only the shadows of the objects, leaving the physical ornaments behind, then vanished. At dawn, Te Kanawa hurried home, grateful to have survived the encounter. The tale of Takarangi and Rao Mahora tells of beauty-ending conflict. Rao Mahora, daughter of a fortified settlement in Taranaki, was famed for her appearance. Takarangi, a young leader from a rival group, heard of her renown. War broke out between their tribes, and his forces laid siege to her father's stronghold. As supplies dwindled, the aged chief asked for water. Some attackers mocked him, but Takarangi personally brought water from a nearby spring. In doing so, he defied his own warriors and demonstrated authority over them. During that moment, he and Rao Mahora looked upon one another and affection took root. Her father, recognizing the opportunity to end bloodshed, offered her in marriage. The union sealed peace between their people. Another story centers on Te Ponga and Puhi Huia. After warfare between their communities, peace was declared. Te Ponga visited the former enemy settlement and during a ceremonial dance saw Puhi Huia perform. Both were struck by admiration. With the help of a loyal servant, Te Ponga arranged to meet her secretly at a spring under the pretense of asking for water. There, they pledged to flee together. He ordered his men to prepare a canoe in advance and sabotage others to prevent pursuit. On the chosen day, Puhi Huia slipped away behind rocks and ran to join him. By the time her people realized what had happened, the lovers were already paddling swiftly across the harbour, out of reach. Finally, the story of Te Huhuti echoes earlier themes of bold devotion. She belonged to the Ngati Kahungunu and fell in love with Te Wātuiapiti, drawn by his presence and reputation. Without hesitation, she swam across Lake Roto Atara to reach him. His mother first saw her emerging from the water, astonished by her composure and radiance. Te Huhuti asked directly for Te Wātuiapiti and was led to him. He welcomed her warmly and their union followed. Descendants later remembered her swim as proof of courage and determination. In her decision, observers see more than romance. A desire to unite peace within the household and strength beyond it.